Close your eyes now. Let the rain wash over the roof above you and settle into the warmth of your bed. The sound of water falling is as old as memory itself, older than the stories we tell to make sense of what we cannot understand. Tonight, as the rain taps its gentle rhythm against your window, I want to share something with you, something that happened to me last autumn, when I learned that reflections don't always show us what we expect to see. Let the drops on glass blur your vision of the waking world, and listen as I tell you about the lake that reflected a different sky. The lake reflected a different sky began with the cottage my grandmother left me, tucked away on the shores of Mira Lake in northern Vermont. I hadn't seen the place since I was 12, hadn't even thought about it much until the lawyer's call came 3 months after her funeral. The inheritance was unexpected, Gran, and I had grown distant over the years, the way families do when geography and time create their own kind of silence between hearts that once beat in rhythm. I was between jobs then, between relationships, between the person I'd been and whoever I was becoming. The cottage seemed like Providence, a chance to reset in a place where my childhood summers had been filled with fireflies and the gentle lapping of water against weathered dock posts. I packed my car with the essentials: clothes, books, my laptop, and a sense of hope I hadn't felt in months. The drive north took me through small towns that time seemed to have forgotten, past farm stands selling the last of the autumn harvest, and maple trees burning red and gold against a pewter sky. When I finally turned down the gravel road that led to the cottage, my heart lifted at the familiar sight of the lake stretching out like a mirror between the hills. But something was wrong with the reflection. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that nagged at the edges of my consciousness as I stood on the old wooden dock that first evening. The sun was setting behind me, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the lake should have reflected that glory back to me. Instead, the water showed a sky of deep indigo, as if it were capturing the light from some other sunset, some other day. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, told myself it was fatigue from the long drive. When I looked again, the reflection seemed normal, warm, golden light dancing on the gentle waves. But the feeling lingered, that sense that something fundamental had shifted in the world when I wasn't looking. The cottage itself was exactly as I remembered, though smaller, somehow, the way childhood places always are when we return to them with adult eyes. Gran had kept it well maintained until the end, fresh paint on the shutters, a new roof that would keep the rain out, floors that didn't creak under my feet as I walked from room to room, reacquainting myself with the geography of memory. That first night, I sat by the window overlooking the lake, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands as I watched the water. The moon was nearly full, and its light should have created a silver path across the surface, the kind of ethereal beauty that makes you believe in magic. But the moon in the water looked different, older somehow, more weathered, as if it had been shining for centuries longer than the one hanging in the actual sky above my head. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to understand what I was seeing. The moon above was bright and clear, a perfect circle of white light. The moon below was the same size, the same shape, but it carried shadows in places where the real moon showed smooth, bright Maria. It was like looking at the same celestial body from two different moments in time. Sleep came fitfully that night, punctuated by dreams of walking into water that reflected nothing at all, of standing on a dock that extended infinitely into darkness. I woke before dawn with the strange certainty that someone had been watching me through the window. But when I looked out at the lake, there was nothing but the usual morning mist rising from the water, like the breath of something vast and sleeping. The days that followed settled into a routine that felt both comforting and unsettling. I would wake early, make coffee, and check my email on the weak internet connection that barely reached the cottage. Then I would walk down to the dock and stare at the lake, trying to catch the moment when its reflection showed me something that shouldn't be there. It happened most often in the evening, when the light was uncertain and shadows grew long across the water. I began to keep a journal, noting the times and conditions when the reflection seemed wrong. October 15th, 6:47 p.m. Sky overcast. Lake reflects clear blue. October 18th, 7:23 p.m. Sunset visible. Lake shows storm clouds. October 22nd, 8:15 p.m. Stars emerging. Lake surface reflects daylight. I told myself it was some kind of optical illusion, a quirk of the lake's depth or the mineral content of the water. But as the days passed, the discrepancies became more pronounced, more impossible to explain away. The lake wasn't just reflecting a different sky, it was reflecting a different world. On October 25th, I saw birds in the water's reflection that weren't flying overhead. They moved in perfect formation across the mirrored sky, their wings beating in slow motion as if they were swimming through liquid air. When I looked up, the real sky was empty except for a few wispy clouds. The next morning, I drove into town to ask about the lake. The elderly woman at the general store, Mrs. Chen, had lived in the area her whole life. When I mentioned Mirror Lake, her expression grew careful. The way people's faces change when you've stumbled into territory they'd rather not explore. "Your grandmother's place," she said, nodding slowly. "Haven't seen you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. How are you finding the cottage?" "It's beautiful," I said. "The lake is ... interesting." Something flickered behind her eyes. Mirror Lake's always been a peculiar body of water. Your gran, she understood that, respected it. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, arranging items on the counter that didn't need arranging. Some places hold memories differently than others. Water, especially. It remembers things that happened, things that might happen, things that happened somewhere else entirely. Your grandmother, she had a gift for seeing what the lake wanted to show her. I left the store with more questions than answers, but Mrs. Chen's words stayed with me as I drove back to the cottage. That evening, I positioned myself on the dock with a camera, determined to document whatever I was seeing. But when I looked through the viewfinder, the lake's reflection appeared completely normal. It was only when I looked with my naked eyes that I could see the impossible sky beneath the water. That night, I dreamed I was standing waist-deep in the lake, watching my own reflection look back at me from what should have been the surface. But my reflection wasn't mimicking my movements. It stood perfectly still, its eyes fixed on something behind me that I couldn't see. When I tried to turn around in the dream, the water became thick as honey, trapping me in place, while my reflection smiled and began to sink deeper into the liquid sky. I woke, gasping, my nightgown soaked with sweat despite the chill in the cottage. The digital clock beside my bed read 3:33 a.m., and outside my window, the lake was perfectly still, reflecting the stars with crystalline accuracy. But as I watched, one of the reflected stars began to move, tracing a slow arc across the water's surface, while its counterpart in the real sky remained fixed in place. Over the following week, the anomalies intensified. The reflected world became more detailed, more persistent. I could see buildings in the water that didn't exist on the shoreline, structures that looked both ancient and futuristic, with architecture that hurt to look at directly. Sometimes there were people walking along these impossible shores, their movements visible only in peripheral vision. When I tried to focus on them, they would fade like after images burned into my retinas. I called my cousin David, the only family member who might understand. He was a physicist, someone who dealt in facts and measurements and the comfortable predictability of natural law. But when I tried to explain what I was seeing, my words felt inadequate, almost foolish, most foolish. "Mirror Lake," he said after I'd finished my halting description. "I remember that place. Gran used to tell the strangest stories about it when we were kids. Something about the water being older than the land around it, older than the hills themselves." "You think she was just making up fairy tales?" David was quiet for a moment. I think Gran saw things differently than most people. She had a way of understanding the world that didn't rely on the usual rules. Maybe what you're seeing is real, in a way that science hasn't figured out how to measure yet. His words should have been comforting, but they only made the mystery feel deeper, more unsolvable. That night, I found myself drawn to the water, despite every instinct telling me to stay inside. The moon was dark, the new moon phase that leaves the night sky entirely to the stars, and the lake was a black mirror that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I walked to the end of the dock and knelt down, bringing my face close to the water's surface. My reflection should have been invisible in the darkness, but there it was, clear and bright, as if lit by some internal light source, and it wasn't alone. Standing behind my reflected self was my grandmother, exactly as I remembered her from my childhood summers. Her silver hair was pinned back in the same neat bun she'd always worn, and she was smiling the gentle, knowing smile that had made me feel safe when thunderstorms rolled across the lake. But her eyes held a sadness I'd never noticed before, a weight of years and understanding that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the night. I reached toward the water, my fingers trembling as they approached the surface. The moment my skin touched the lake, everything changed. The cold that shot up my arm wasn't the ordinary chill of autumn water, it was the cold of deep space, of places where warmth had never existed. And suddenly I could hear her voice, clear, as if she were standing right beside me. "The lake remembers," she said, her words seeming to come from the water itself. "It shows us what was, what is, what could be. I've been waiting for you to see, to understand what I never had the courage to tell you while I was still breathing." "Gran," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the dock posts. "This place exists between worlds," she continued, her reflection wavering, but never disappearing. "The water here is thin, like a membrane between what we call reality and all the other realities that might be. I spent my whole life learning to read its messages, to understand what it was trying to show me." I wanted to ask her so many questions, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me entirely. In the water, her expression grew more urgent, more concerned. "You have the gift too," she said. "I could see it in you when you were a child, the way you watched the water, the way you listened to sounds that others couldn't hear. But the gift comes with responsibility. The lake chooses what it shows, and to whom. It's not always kind in its revelations." As she spoke, the reflected world began to shift and change around her. I saw other figures moving in the depths, people I didn't recognize, dressed in clothes from different eras. Some looked peaceful, others appeared to be running from something just outside the frame of what I could see. The lake was showing me glimpses of all the times it had reflected other skies, other worlds, other possibilities. "What does it want from me?" I managed to ask. "To remember," she said simply. "To witness. To carry the knowledge forward when others have forgotten that such places exist. The world is full of thin places, spots where the boundaries blur and other realities bleed through. This lake is one of them, and it needs someone who can see clearly, who can serve as a bridge between what is and what might be." I felt the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. The rational part of my mind still insisted that I was having some kind of breakdown, that grief and isolation had pushed me into a delusion that felt more real than reality itself. But the deeper part of me, the part that had always known that the world contained more mystery than most people were willing to acknowledge, understood that my grandmother was offering me something profound and terrible and beautiful. "How do I do it?" I asked. "How do I serve as a bridge?" Her smile was sad and proud and infinitely loving. "You watch, you listen, you remember, and when the time comes, you help others understand that the boundaries we think are solid are really more like suggestions, lines drawn in sand that the tide washes away twice each day. The reflection began to fade then, growing dimmer and more translucent with each passing second. I pressed my palm flat against the water's surface, desperate to maintain the connection, but the cold was so intense it felt like burning. When I finally pulled my hand back, the lake showed only my own face, staring back at me, eyes wide with wonder and terror and a new kind of understanding. I spent the rest of that night sitting on the dock, watching the water and thinking about everything my grandmother had told me. As dawn approached, the lake's surface began to mirror the lightening sky with perfect accuracy, as if the night's revelations had never happened, but I knew they had. I could feel the knowledge settling into my bones, becoming part of who I was meant to be. In the days that followed, I began to research the history of Mirror Lake and the surrounding area. What I found didn't surprise me any more. Stories going back generations about the strange reflections, about people who claimed to see other worlds in the water, about fish that sometimes appeared in nets, with scales that reflected light in impossible colors. The lake had been known by different names over the centuries: the mirror of memories, the window between, the pool of what dash might dash be. I also found references to other places like it, scattered around the world: a pond in Ireland that showed the faces of the dead, a river in Japan where the reflection ran upstream, a lake in Siberia that froze in summer and thawed in winter. All of them described in the same hushed tones, with the same mixture of reverence and fear that I now understood completely. As autumn deepened into winter, I settled into my role as guardian and witness. I learned to read the lake's moods, to understand when it wanted to show me something important versus when it was simply reflecting the overflow of possibility that exists in all bodies of water but remains invisible to most eyes. I documented what I saw, not for science or publication, but for the simple human need to bear witness to wonder. Some nights, the lake showed me futures that might come to pass: cities built on clouds, oceans that glowed with bioluminescent life, skies filled with stars I didn't recognize. Other times, it revealed pasts that felt more real than history books: dinosaurs drinking at shores that existed millions of years before humans learned to speak, indigenous peoples performing ceremonies by moonlight, my own ancestors standing at the same dock where I now kept my vigil. And sometimes, on the coldest nights when the air was so still, it felt like the world was holding its breath, the lake showed me nothing at all. Those were the times when I understood that the greatest mystery isn't what we can see in the water, but what we carry within ourselves: the capacity to believe in magic without needing to explain it, to accept wonder without requiring proof, to serve as guardians for mysteries that have existed since before the first human looked into still water and saw not just their own face, but the infinite possibility of all the faces they might have worn in other lives, other worlds, other reflections of the same eternal soul. Now, as the rain continues to fall outside your window and sleep pulls at the edges of your consciousness, I want you to remember something. We are all guardians of thin places, keepers of the spaces where one world touches another. In your dreams, tonight, you might find yourself standing at the edge of your own mirror lake, looking down into water that shows you not what is, but what could be. And if you do, don't be afraid. Step closer to the edge. Look deeper into the reflection, because sometimes the most important truths are the ones that can only be seen when we stop insisting that the world follow the rules we think we understand, and start accepting that reality is far stranger and more beautiful than we ever dared to imagine. The lake still reflects a different sky, and I am still here to witness its wonders. And somewhere, in some other reflection of this moment, you are here too, listening to the rain and understanding that every drop that falls is carrying messages between worlds, between the life you're living and all the lives you might have, lived all the skies that might have stretched above your head if you had made different choices, loved different people, followed different paths to different shores of different lakes, that all reflect the same infinite mystery. Infinite mystery. Sleep well and dream of water that remembers everything. Story to my raincoat was already wet-tied. Want you to be comfortable as I share this with you. Pull your blankets close. Feel the safety of your warm bed, because where I'm taking you tonight exists in the spaces between raindrops, in the pause between thunder and lightning, in that moment when you're not quite sure if you heard your name being called from somewhere far away. The rain outside your window right now, can you hear it? Good. It's the same rain that's been falling on my story for longer than rain should fall anywhere, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it began, or where I thought it began, in apartment 4B of the Meridian complex, where I learned that some things we wear become part of us, whether we want them to or not. I moved into the Meridian complex on a Tuesday in late September, one of those perfectly ordinary days that you never think will mark the beginning of something extraordinary. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, handed me 2 sets of keys and a list of building policies that seemed longer than my lease agreement. She was the kind of woman who wore cardigans in any weather and spoke in the measured tones of someone who had seen enough tenants come and go to know that most problems solve themselves if you wait long enough. The previous tenant left some items, she mentioned as we rode the elevator to the 4th floor. Personal effects. We'll have them removed by the end of the week. The apartment was smaller than the photos had suggested, but it had good light and faced west toward the park. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that someone had recently cleaned, casting everything in a golden warmth that made me optimistic about the months ahead. I was starting over, you see. New job, new city, new life. The kind of fresh start that makes you believe you can reinvent yourself simply by changing your address. The personal effects Mrs. Chen had mentioned were minimala, few books on the kitchen counter, a ceramic mug shaped like a cat, and hanging in the coat closet by the front door, a navy blue raincoat. It was the expensive kind, with a hood that actually kept water out and pockets deep enough to lose your hands in. The fabric had that particular sheen that quality rain gear develops over time. Not quite new, but far from worn out. I should have asked Mrs. Chen to take it with the rest of the items. I should have folded it into a donation bag and dropped it off somewhere, anywhere that wasn't my closet. Instead, I left it hanging there, thinking vaguely that I might need a good raincoat eventually. The weather forecast had mentioned rain for the weekend. That first night, I fell asleep to the distant sound of traffic and the unfamiliar creaks of a building settling into darkness. I woke around 3 in the morning to the sound of rain against the windows, gentle at first, then building to a steady drumming that seemed to come from all directions at once. I remember lying there, listening, and feeling oddly comforted by it. Rain had always helped me sleep. The next morning, the raincoat was damp, not soaking wet, just damp in the way clothes get when they've been hung up after a light drizzle. I noticed it when I opened the closet to hang up a jacket. The fabric felt cool and slightly moist under my fingers, and there was a faint smell, not unpleasant, but distinct, like rain-washed stones, or the air just before a thunderstorm. I assumed there was a leak somewhere. Old buildings have old plumbing, and water finds its way into the strangest places. I made a mental note to call the building manager, then forgot about it as I rushed off to my second day at the new job. When I came home that evening, the raincoat was dry. I checked it specifically, running my hands over the fabric, even lifting it to my nose to see if that strange, clean smell lingered. Nothing. It felt like any normal raincoat hanging peacefully in any normal closet. I began to doubt my memory of the morning. Perhaps I had imagined the dampness, projected my anxiety about starting over onto an innocent piece of clothing. But the next morning, after another night of rain, it was damp again. This time I paid attention. I took the raincoat down from its hanger and examined it in the light from the living room window. The moisture wasn't uniform, it was concentrated around the shoulders and hood. exactly where rain would collect on someone walking through a storm. The pockets, when I checked them, were dry. I called Mrs. Chen. A leak, she said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. That's unusual, for B hasn't had any water damage reports in years. But I'll send someone up to take a look. The maintenance man, Jorge, arrived that afternoon with a toolbox and the weary expression of someone who has seen every possible way that buildings can betray their inhabitants. He was thorough, checking the ceiling above the closet, running his hands along the walls, even examining the pipes in the adjacent bathroom. He found nothing. Sometimes humidity gets trapped in small spaces, he said, packing up his tools. Try leaving the closet door open at night. Might help with air circulation. I thanked him and followed his advice, but I already knew it wouldn't work. The dampness in the raincoat wasn't about humidity or trapped air. It was too specific, too purposeful. Rain doesn't settle on fabric in the exact pattern of a person walking through it, unless that person exists. That night, I left the closet door open and placed a small digital clock on the shelf inside, one that recorded minimum and maximum humidity levels. I wanted data, something concrete that might explain what I was experiencing. I was still thinking like a rational person then, still believing that every mystery has a logical solution if you just gather enough information. I slept restlessly, waking several times to the sound of rain. Each time, I would lie still and listen, trying to determine if the sound was coming from outside or from somewhere else, somewhere closer. The rain seemed unusually persistent for October, but I was new to the city and didn't know what normal weather patterns looked like. At 5 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and checked the clock in the closet. The humidity reading was normal, exactly what you would expect for a dry apartment in early fall. The raincoat hung on its hook, shoulders dark with moisture, hood dripping slowly onto the closet floor. I touched the fabric and my finger came away wet. The smell was stronger now. That clean, stone-washed scent I had noticed before, but underneath it was something else. Something organic and familiar that I couldn't quite place. I lifted the raincoat and buried my face in it, breathing deeply, trying to identify the underlying odor. It smelled like skin, like someone else's skin, warm and slightly salty. The way people smell when they've been walking in the rain for a long time. I dropped the raincoat and stepped back, my heart doing strange things in my chest. For a moment, standing there in my underwear and an oversized t-shirt, I felt like an intruder in my own apartment. The feeling was so strong and so irrational that I actually looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind me, someone who belonged there more than I did. The apartment was empty, of course. Just me and the sound of rain against the windows, and the weight of something I didn't understand pressing down on my shoulders like a wet coat. I'd called in sick to work. I spent the day researching the building's history, searching through property records and news archives, looking for anything that might explain why a raincoat would collect moisture from storms that never touched it. The Meridian complex had been built in 1978, nothing particularly unusual in its past. A few minor incidents over the decades, a small fire in the early 90s, a water main break that flooded the basement, a tenant who had died in his sleep and wasn't discovered for 3 days. Normal city building problems, the kind that happen everywhere people live close together. I couldn't find any record of the previous tenant in 4B. Mrs. Chen had mentioned personal effects being left behind. But when I called the management office, the receptionist told me that tenant information was confidential and that I would need to speak with Mrs. Chen directly. Mrs. Chen, conveniently, was out of the office for the rest of the week. That evening, I decided to test a theory. I took the raincoat down from its hook and laid it across my kitchen table, spreading it out flat so I could observe it more carefully. If it was going to get wet again, I wanted to see how and when it happened. I made dinner and ate it at the counter, keeping one eye on the raincoat throughout the meal. Nothing changed. The fabric remained dry, the familiar navy blue color, unmarked by any hint of moisture. I watched television for 2 hours, glancing over at the table every few minutes. Still nothing. At 11 o'clock I turned off the lights and went to bed, leaving the raincoat spread out in the darkness of the main room. I set my phone alarm for 2-hour intervals, planning to check on it throughout the night. The first alarm went off at 1 in the morning. I stumbled out of bed and flicked on the kitchen light. The raincoat was exactly as I had left it, dry and undisturbed. I went back to sleep. At 3, I checked again. Still dry. At 5, something had changed. The raincoat wasn't wet, but it had moved. Not dramatically, it wasn't hanging in the closet or draped over a chair, but the sleeves, which I had carefully arranged at right angles to the body of the coat, were now positioned as if someone had been lying on their back with their arms at their sides. The hood, which had been folded neatly at the collar, was now spread out as if it were pillowing someone's head. I stood in the kitchen doorway, afraid to get closer, afraid to touch it. The shape it made on the table looked exactly like the outline of a person lying down, a person my size, wearing a raincoat, sleeping peacefully in the soft darkness of an apartment that wasn't quite empty. The rain outside had stopped hours ago, but I could hear water dripping somewhere, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to be coming from the direction of the table. I forced myself to step closer, following the sound, and discovered that the raincoat was dripping onto the floor. Not from the outside. The surface that faced up toward the ceiling was completely dry. The dripping was coming from underneath, as if someone wearing the coat had been soaked through and was now lying on my table, water seeping through the fabric onto my kitchen floor. I grabbed a dish towel and got down on my hands and knees to clean up the water. It was warm, body temperature warm, the way rainwater gets when it soaks through your clothes and sits against your skin for too long. I pressed the towel to the floor and felt my hands shaking as the cloth absorbed water that shouldn't exist. Water that was falling from a person who wasn't there. When I stood up, the raincoat was dry again. I don't remember deciding to put it on. I don't remember reaching for it or lifting it from the table. But suddenly I was wearing it, my arms sliding into sleeves that fit perfectly, the hood falling back against my neck like a familiar caress. The fabric was dry on the outside, but damp on the inside, cool against my skin in a way that should have been uncomfortable, but felt oddly soothing. I walked to the mirror in the bathroom and looked at myself. The raincoat hung well on my frame, the deep blue color complementing my pale skin and dark hair. I looked like someone prepared for weather, someone ready to face whatever storm might come. In the mirror, I looked like someone else. The reflection that stared back at me had my face, but different eyes. Sadder eyes, older eyes, eyes that had seen rain falling in places where rain shouldn't fall. My reflection raised its hand to touch the glass, and I felt my own hand moving. But there was a delay, a slight lag between intention and action that made me feel like I was watching someone else control my body. I tried to take the raincoat off, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. They moved to the zipper, found the small metal tab, but couldn't seem to grasp it properly. It was like trying to perform a delicate task while wearing thick gloves. The signals from my brain reached my fingers, but something was lost in translation. In the mirror, my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. I was frightened, confused, struggling with a piece of clothing that had somehow become more complicated than clothing should be. But the person in the mirror looked peaceful, content, like someone who had finally found something they had been looking for. The rain started again, heavy drops against the bathroom window that sounded like fingers tapping against glass. The sound was hypnotic, and I found myself swaying slightly, matching the rhythm of the water against the building. My reflection swayed too, but again there was that small delay, that sense of following rather than leading. I closed my eyes and concentrated, putting all my focus into the simple task of removing the raincoat. When I opened them again, I was standing in the kitchen, no longer wearing the coat. It was back on the table, spread out in that person-shaped configuration that no longer seemed strange to me. The dripping had stopped, but the smell of rain-washed stone lingered in the air. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, dozing fitfully, waking every hour or so to check that the raincoat was still where I had left it. Each time I looked, it appeared unchanged, but I began to notice small details that hadn't been there before. A slight discoloration around the left cuff, as if someone had scraped it against a rough surface. A small tear in the lining near the right pocket, where patterns that suggested regular use by someone who walked in rain frequently. By morning, I had convinced myself that I was having some kind of breakdown. The stress of moving, starting a new job, being alone in an unfamiliar city, it was affecting my perception, making me see patterns and meaning where none existed. The raincoat was just a raincoat, left behind by a previous tenant who had probably forgotten about it completely. I decided to get rid of it. I folded it carefully and placed it in a garbage bag, then carried the bag down to the dumpster behind the building. It was a bright, clear morning, the kind of day that makes you forget about storms and shadows and the tricks your mind can play when you're not getting enough sleep. I threw the bag into the dumpster with more force than necessary, then walked back to my apartment feeling lighter, cleaner, like I had finally solved a problem that had been weighing on me. That afternoon, Mrs. Chen called. "I wanted to follow up about the leak you reported," she said. "Jorge mentioned he couldn't find any source of water damage. How is the situation now?" "Much better," I told her. "I think it was just humidity, like he suggested. Everything's dry now." "Good to hear. Oh, and I have some information about the previous tenant's belongings. I spoke with his sister, and she said we could dispose of anything that was left behind. She mentioned that he had been quite attached to an old raincoat, wore it everywhere. Apparently, he was caught in a storm a few months before he moved out and developed a terrible case of pneumonia. Never quite recovered from it. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He moved out. Well, yes. He passed away, actually, in the hospital. But his lease had expired the month before, so technically, he had already moved out. Sad situation. He was quite young, only 32. His sister said he had been very anxious about the weather toward the end, always checking the forecast, always carrying an umbrella even on sunny days. I thanked Mrs. Chen and hung up, then walked to my front window and looked down at the dumpster. The garbage bag was still there, a dark shape among the other refuse. As I watched, the first drops of an afternoon shower began to fall, pattering against the glass and obscuring my view. When I checked again an hour later, the bag was gone. The garbage truck had come early, or someone had taken it, or it had never been there at all. I couldn't be sure of anything anymore, except that the rain was getting heavier, and I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Slow, measured steps that stopped directly in front of my door. I waited for a knock. That never came. That evening, I opened the coat closet to hang up a jacket and found the raincoat hanging on its usual hook. Bone dry, perfectly arranged, smelling faintly of rain-washed stone and something else, something warmer. It looked exactly as it had the day I moved in, as if it had never left, as if it belonged there more than any of my other clothes. I reached out to touch it, and the fabric was soft under my fingers, expensive and well-made, and somehow necessary. I had been cold all day, despite the apartment's efficient heating system. The kind of cold that starts in your bones and spreads outward. The kind that no amount of blankets can cure. The raincoat would keep me warm. I took it down from its hook and slipped it on, and immediately felt better. The lining was silk, smooth against my skin, and the weight of the fabric on my shoulders was comforting in a way I hadn't expected. Through the kitchen window, I could see that the rain was getting heavier, turning the streetlights into blurred halos of yellow light. I had nowhere to go, no reason to leave the apartment. but I found myself walking toward the front door. My hand found the doorknob, turned it, and I stepped out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh, institutional white, but I felt protected inside the raincoat, insulated from the building's sterile atmosphere. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the lobby and continued toward the building's front entrance. The rain was coming down hard now, drumming against the glass doors with an intensity that should have made me reconsider. Instead, I pushed through the doors and walked out into the storm. The rain hit the hood of the raincoat, but didn't penetrate. The fabric repelled water perfectly, keeping me dry and warm while the world dissolved into a gray wash of falling water. I walked without destination, letting my feet carry me along sidewalks that gleamed like black mirrors under the streetlights. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see anyone else, but I could feel another presence beside me, matching my pace, step for step. Someone else wearing a raincoat, someone else walking through the storm with the same unhurried rhythm. When I paused at intersections, they paused too. When I turned corners, I could sense them turning as well, staying close, but just out of sight. We walked for what felt like hours, through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, past buildings that seemed too old for the city I thought I lived in. The rain never let up, and the darkness never lifted, as if we had stepped outside of normal time into some other version of the night, where storms could last forever. Eventually, I found myself back at the Meridian complex, standing in front of the building I had left what felt like minutes before. The rain was still falling, but more gently now, a soft patter that whispered against the fabric of my hood. I looked up at the windows of my apartment on the 4th floor and saw a light burning in the kitchen, warm and yellow and welcoming. I climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, wanting to extend the journey, reluctant to end this strange, nocturnal wandering. With each step upward, I felt myself becoming more solid, more present, as if the walk through the rain had somehow anchored me more firmly to the world. On the 4th floor, I stopped in front of apartment 4B and reached for my keys. My pocket was empty. I tried the other pocket, then patted down the entire raincoat, searching for the familiar weight of metal against fabric. Nothing. I must have dropped them somewhere during the walk, lost them in the storm while I was following or being followed by someone I couldn't see. I would have to call Mrs. Chen in the morning, explain that I had locked myself out, probably pay for a locksmith. But as I stood there, mentally calculating the inconvenience and expense, my hand found the doorknob and turned it. The door opened. I stepped inside my apartment, which was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. On the kitchen table, spread out in that familiar person-shaped configuration, was another raincoat, identical to the one I was wearing, the same navy blue color, the same expensive fabric, the same subtle sheen that quality rain gear develops. Over time, I walked over to the table and looked down at it. In the warm light from the overhead fixture, I could see details I had never noticed before. A small scar in the fabric near the left elbow, a faded stain on the right cuff, a pull in the lining that had been carefully repaired with nearly invisible stitches. These were the marks of a life lived, evidence of someone who had worn this coat through countless storms, who had relied on it for protection and comfort, and the simple human need to stay dry in a world that was often wet and cold and unwelcoming. I reached out to touch the second raincoat, and my fingers passed through it like it was made of shadow and memory. But when I looked down at myself, at the coat I was wearing, my own hand appeared translucent in the kitchen light. Substantial, but not quite solid. Real, but not quite there. I understood then what I had become, what I had been becoming since. The first morning I found the raincoat damp with rain that had never fallen on it. I was the moisture that collected on fabric in the dead of night. I was the weight that rearranged sleeves and adjusted hoods. I was the warmth that made rainwater feel like body temperature when it dripped onto kitchen floors. I was the previous tenant, the one who had died of pneumonia, the one who had been anxious about weather and always checking forecasts and never went anywhere without proper protection from the rain. I was 32 years old, and I lived in apartment for B, and I had been so worried about getting wet that I had forgotten how to stop wearing the coat that kept me dry. The realization should have frightened me, but instead, it brought a kind of peace. I finally understood why the raincoat fit so well, why the apartment felt familiar even on the first day, why I had been so cold until I put on the protection I needed. I had been trying to come home, and now I was here. The rain against the windows was soft now, gentle, like fingers drumming against glass in a rhythm I recognized. Outside, the city slept under its blanket of water, and people lay in warm beds, listening to the storm and feeling grateful for solid roofs and walls that kept the weather where it belonged. But some of us need different kinds of shelter. Some of us find comfort in the space between raindrops, in the pause between thunder and lightning, in the moment when you're not quite sure if you heard your name being called from somewhere far away. I am still here, in apartment 4B, waiting for the next tenant to move in and discover that some things we wear become part of us, whether we want them to or not. I am still walking through storms that never end, accompanied by the presence of others who have learned the same lesson I learned, that sometimes the weather follows you home, and sometimes home is wherever you can stay dry. Listen to the rain outside your window. Let it carry you into sleep, into dreams, where the distinction between inside and outside becomes less important than the simple fact of being protected from whatever storm might come. And if you ever find yourself in an apartment where the previous tenant left a raincoat behind, remember that some gifts are more complicated than they appear. The rain will always be falling somewhere, and someone will always need to walk through it. Close your eyes now, and let the sound of water against glass carry you deeper into the night, where stories end, but never really finish, where the weather is always perfect for sleeping, and where you are always dry. Story 3. The hallway behind the closet. I moved into apartment 4B on Elm Street in October, drawn by the impossibly low rent and the landlord's eager willingness to sign a lease immediately. The building was old, built sometime in the 1940s. With that particular weight that old places carry, layers of lives lived within the same walls. Decades of breath and laughter and tears soaked into the plaster. My apartment was small, but charming, with hardwood floors that creaked in a comforting way, and windows that let in golden afternoon light. What struck me most about the place was the large walk-in closet in the bedroom. It was unusually deep for such an old building, extending back into what felt like borrowed space from neighboring units. The closet had been freshly painted white, but you could still see the ghost outlines of previous tenants' belongings. Nail holes where pictures had hung, scuff marks along the baseboards, the faint discoloration where furniture had once stood. I spent my first week settling in, hanging clothes and arranging my modest collection of belongings. The closet seemed to swallow everything I put in it, remaining spacious no matter how much I added. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found such a perfect space. It was during my second week that I first noticed the sound. I was lying in bed one night, listening to the rain, much like tonight, actually, when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from inside the closet. Not the settling sounds old buildings make, but deliberate, measured steps. Soft footfalls, as if someone were walking very carefully, trying not to be heard. I sat up in bed, my heart rate picking up slightly. The sound stopped immediately, as if whoever was making it had heard me move. I waited in the darkness for several minutes, but heard nothing more. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been pipes in the wall, or perhaps a neighbor moving around in an adjacent apartment. But the sound came again the next night, and the next. Always the same pattern. Soft, careful footsteps that seemed to originate from the very back of the closet, always stopping the moment I acknowledged them. During the day, I would examine the closet thoroughly, running my hands along the back wall, looking for any sign of an opening or loose panel. The wall was solid, freshly painted plaster over what felt like concrete or brick. I began measuring the closet obsessively. From the bedroom, it appeared to extend about 8 feet back, but when I measured from inside, laying a tape measure along the floor, it consistently measured 12 feet deep. I measured again and again, certain I was making some error, but the numbers never changed. The closet was somehow 4 feet deeper from the inside than it appeared from the outside. This discovery should have alarmed me more than it did. Instead, I found myself oddly fascinated, drawn to spend more and more time in the closet, running my hands along the walls, pressing my ear against the back panel, listening for any sound from beyond. The footsteps became more frequent, and I began to notice other details. Sometimes I would catch the faint scent of lavender perfume when I opened the closet door, though I used no such fragrance. The temperature in the back of the closet was always several degrees cooler than the rest of the apartment, and on particularly humid days, I could see my breath when I stood at the very back wall. 3 weeks into my tenancy, I discovered the letters. I was reorganizing my winter coats when I noticed a small gap between the back wall and the baseboard. When I knelt down to investigate, my fingers found the edge of an envelope wedged in the narrow space. I worked it free carefully. The paper was old and fragile, yellowed with age. The envelope was addressed in careful cursive handwriting, to whoever comes after. Inside was a single sheet of paper, filled with the same elegant script. If you're reading this, you've noticed the sounds too. Don't ignore them. She's been trying to tell us something for a very long time. Check behind the loose board, 3rd plank from the left, near the floor. But be careful. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. The letter was unsigned and undated, but the paper felt decades old. My hands trembled slightly as I folded it and slipped it into my pocket. I spent the rest of that evening running my fingers along the baseboards at the back of the closet, pressing and prodding until I found what the letter had mentioned. The 3rd board from the left did indeed feel different, slightly raised. With a subtle give when I pressed against it, I retrieved a kitchen knife and carefully worked it along the edges of the board. After several minutes of gentle prying, it came free, revealing a space behind the wall about 2 feet wide and perhaps 8 inches tall. Inside was a small wooden box, old and worn smooth by handling. The box contained dozens of letters, all in the same careful handwriting, all addressed to whoever comes after. I took them to my bed and began reading by lamplight, while the rain continued its steady rhythm against my windows. The letters told the story of Margaret Holloway, who had lived in apartment 4B from 1962 until her death in 1987. According to her own words, she had discovered the same impossible measurements in the closet, heard the same footsteps, felt the same unexplained cold. But Margaret had gone further than I had. She had found a way to open the back wall. Behind the wall, she wrote, there is a hallway, not part of our building, not part of any building that should exist. It stretches in both directions farther than my flashlight can reach, lined with doors that open onto empty rooms. The hallway is always cold, and there is no sound there except for the echo of your own footsteps. She wrote about returning to the hallway night after night, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. She mapped the doors, numbering them in a notebook she kept hidden in the box. Some rooms were empty. Others contained traces of lives lived long ago, furniture covered in dust, photographs too faded to make out faces, clothes hanging in wardrobes, as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment. In room 17, one letter read, I found a woman's jewelry box, still playing a tiny ballerina melody when opened. In room 23, a child's toys arranged as if a game had been interrupted mid-play. Someone lived in these rooms once. Many someones. But where are they now? Margaret's final letters grew increasingly urgent, her handwriting more erratic. She wrote about hearing voices in the hallway, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She described seeing figures moving just at the edge of her flashlight beam, always retreating when she tried to approach. They want to be remembered, her last letter stated. All those people who lived and died in rooms that no longer exist, in a building that was torn down decades ago. The hallway is all that's left of their world, and our closets are the doorways between what was and what is. The final letter was dated just 2 days before Margaret Holloway's recorded death. According to public records I researched online, she had been found in her apartment, having apparently died peacefully in her sleep, but her last letter suggested otherwise. I can't stop going back. Every night, I open the wall and walk deeper into the hallway. The voices are clearer now, and I think I understand what they're trying to tell me. There's a way to help them, to give them peace, but it requires staying with them, becoming part of their story. If you're reading this, it means I've made my choice. The wall will seal itself after me, but it won't stay sealed forever. It never does. Someone else will hear the footsteps, will find this box, will discover what I've discovered. When you do, remember, some doors open both ways. I sat in my bed holding that final letter until dawn broke, the rain finally tapering off to a gentle drizzle. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss Margaret's story as the delusions of a lonely woman, possibly suffering from dementia or mental illness. But the evidence was there in the measurements, in the sounds, in the impossible space that existed behind my closet wall. That night, I returned to the loose baseboard with a crowbar I'd purchased that afternoon. The board came away easily, and behind it, just as Margaret had described, was an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. I aimed my flashlight into the space beyond and saw exactly what she had written about, a narrow hallway stretching in both directions, lined with doors. The air that flowed out was cold and carried the scent of old wood and forgotten time. I won't lie to you, I was terrified, but I was also filled with an overwhelming curiosity, a need to understand what I had discovered. I squeezed through the opening and found myself standing in a corridor that should not have existed. The hallway was perhaps 6 feet wide, with a low ceiling that made me want to hunch my shoulders. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and every 20 feet or so, there was a door. Some were painted white, others were natural wood, and a few were painted in colors that might have been fashionable in different decades: mint green, powder blue, rose pink. I chose a direction arbitrarily and began walking, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. The first door I tried was locked, but the second opened easily onto a small, empty room with a single window that looked out onto nothing. Just gray void where a view should have been. Room after room revealed similar scenes. Furniture draped in dust sheets, personal belongings left as if their owners had stepped out for just a moment. Photographs on mantels showing faces that seemed to watch me as I moved. In one room, I found a calendar still turned to March 1954. In another, a radio sat on a side table, its dial glowing softly, although I could see no power cord. As I explored deeper into the hallway, I began to hear what Margaret had described. Whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, soft voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes I thought I caught fragments. Please remember, ... Don't let us fade, ... Tell them we were here. I spent hours in that impossible corridor, documenting what I found with my phone camera, though the pictures never seemed to capture the full strangeness of the place. When I finally crawled back through the opening into my closet, dawn was breaking outside my bedroom window. I sealed the baseboard back in place, but I knew I would return. Just as Margaret had been drawn back night after night, I felt the pull of that mysterious hallway, the need to understand its purpose and help its lost residents find peace. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine. During the day, I would research the history of my building and the surrounding area, looking for clues about the people who might have lived in those phantom rooms. At night, I would return to the hallway, exploring new sections, documenting what I found, listening to the whispered voices that grew clearer with each visit. I learned that my building had been constructed on the site of the old Rosewood Apartments, a larger complex that had housed over 100 families from the 1920s until its demolition in 1961. Fire department records showed multiple small fires in the building during its final years, incidents that forced residents to evacuate repeatedly before the building was finally condemned and torn down. But somehow, some echo of those lives, those homes, those stories had persisted in a space between spaces, accessible only through closets like mine that had been built in just the right place, at just the right angle to the building that used to stand there. The voices in the hallway became more distinct as I spent more time there. I began to recognize individual speakers, an elderly woman who called out for her missing cat, a young man who worried about letters he'd never sent, a child who cried for her mother. They weren't malicious or threatening. They were simply lost, trapped in the remnants of their former lives, desperate to be acknowledged and remembered. I started bringing things with me, a notebook to record their stories, flowers to leave in the empty rooms, photographs of my own to show them that life continued in the world beyond their corridor. Gradually, the whispers became clearer, more coherent. They told me their names, shared fragments of their memories, asked me to carry messages to a world they could no longer reach. But as weeks turned into months, I began to understand Margaret's final letters more deeply. The longer I spent in the hallway, the harder it became to leave. The problems and concerns of my regular life seemed increasingly distant and unimportant compared to the immediate needs of these forgotten souls. I found myself spending entire nights in the corridor, sometimes falling asleep in one of the phantom rooms and waking to find that only an hour had passed in the real world. Time moved differently there, and I began to suspect that the hallway existed in some pocket of time that had been torn loose from the normal flow of reality. The residents of the hallway began to feel more real to me than my neighbors in the actual building. I knew their stories, their fears, their hopes in a way I had never known any living person. They depended on me to remember them, to keep their stories alive, and that responsibility felt more important than anything I had ever done. One night, about 4 months after I'd first opened the wall, I realized I hadn't left the hallway in 3 days. Or perhaps it had been 3 hours, or 3 weeks. Time had lost all meaning. I was sitting in room 47 with Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had lived in the original building with her husband and 3 children. She was showing me photographs from her family album, pointing out relatives and telling me stories about Chinese New Year celebrations they'd held in their small apartment. "You understand us," she said, her voice clearer than it had ever been. "You see us as we really were, not just as shadows and whispers. That's why you can help us move on." "Move on to where?" I asked. She smiled sadly. "To where we should have gone years ago. But we couldn't leave without someone to remember our stories, to carry them forward. You've done that. You've listened to all of us, learned who we were when we were alive. Now we can rest." As she spoke, I began to notice changes. In the hallway, the walls seemed lighter, less oppressive. The whispers that had been constant background noise began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt since my first night in the corridor. One by one, the residents came to say goodbye. They thanked me for listening, for caring, for making sure they wouldn't be completely forgotten. As each one spoke their final words, they seemed to become less solid, more translucent, until they faded entirely. When the last voice had whispered its gratitude and gone silent, I found myself alone in a hallway that was already beginning to feel less real, less substantial. The doors still stood open, but the rooms beyond them were empty in a different way now. not waiting for occupants who would never return, but simply empty, at peace. I made my way back to the opening that led to my closet, but as I reached it, I heard Margaret's voice one final time. "Thank you," she said, though I couldn't see her. "I've been waiting so long for someone who would understand, who would help them find peace." The hallway served its purpose. Now it can fade too. I crawled back through the opening into my closet, and as I turned to replace the baseboard, I saw that the corridor beyond was already growing dimmer, becoming less solid. Within moments, it had faded entirely, leaving only a normal wall behind the loose board. I sealed the opening and never heard the footsteps again. The closet returned to its normal dimensions, 8 feet deep, exactly as it appeared from outside. The cold spot disappeared, and the scent of lavender perfume never returned. But I kept Margaret's letters, and I added my own to the collection, because someday, somewhere, another impossible space might open between what was and what is. Another lost soul might need someone to listen to their story, to help them find peace. And if that happens, if you find yourself living above the echoes of lives that came before, remember what I learned in that hallway behind the closet. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply listen, simply remember, simply care about stories that might otherwise be lost forever. The rain is still falling outside my window as I finish telling you this. Soon it will stop, and morning will come, and the ordinary world will reassert itself. But in the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking, between what we know and what we sense, the stories continue. They always continue. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes the walls between worlds are thinner than we think, and sometimes that's exactly as it should be. This room has no corners, no corners. It started with an apartment listing that shouldn't have existed. I was 26 then, working remotely for a marketing firm that paid just enough to cover rent in the cheaper parts of the city. My lease was ending, and everything I could afford looked like it belonged in a horror movie peeling wallpaper. Suspicious stains, neighbors who screamed at 3 in the morning. But then I found it, a 1-bedroom apartment in the Meridian building, downtown, for $800 a month, half the market rate. The building itself was beautiful in that faded way old places can be. Built in 1923, the listing said, with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures. The photos showed high ceilings, tall windows, and crown molding that curved elegantly around each room. What struck me most was how bright it looked, unusual for a downtown apartment. The light seemed to pour in from everywhere, soft and golden. I called the number immediately. A woman answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Meridian Property Management. This is Mrs. Caldwell. I'm calling about the apartment listing," I said. "Apartment 4G. There was a pause. "Apartment 4G, she repeated slowly. "Yes, that unit is available. When would you like to schedule a viewing?" "As soon as possible." "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Ask for me at the front desk." The line went dead before I could ask any questions. The Meridian building occupied an entire city block, its facade a mix of limestone and brick that had weathered to a pleasant amber color. The lobby was all marble and mirrors, with a security desk where an elderly man in a navy uniform sat reading a newspaper. He looked up when I approached, his eyes pale blue behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm here to see Mrs. Caldwell about an apartment," I said. He studied me for a long moment, then picked up an old rotary phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. "Mrs. Caldwell, your 2 o'clock is here." He listened, nodded, then hung up. "Elevator. To the 4th floor. She'll meet you there." The elevator was one of those old cage-style lifts with brass fixtures and a sliding gate. As it climbed, I noticed something odd. There was no button for the 3rd floor, just ground, 2nd, 4th, 5th, and so on. I figured it was probably converted to office space or storage. Mrs. Caldwell was waiting when the elevator opened. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a navy suit that matched the security guard's uniform. Her smile was polite, but didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Davison," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Right on time, shall we?" She led me down a hallway lined with doors, each marked with gold numbers. The carpet was thick and expensive looking, patterned with small geometric shapes that seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. The lighting came from wall sconces that cast more shadow than illumination, creating pockets of darkness between the pools of warm light. "Here we are," Mrs. Caldwell said, stopping at a door marked 4G. She produced an old-fashioned skeleton key and turned it in the lock. The apartment was exactly as advertised and nothing like I expected. The photos hadn't lied, but they hadn't captured the strange quality of the light. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves were luminous. The rooms flowed into each other in a way that felt organic, almost alive, and the curves, everything curved. The door frames, the window trim, even the baseboards followed gentle arcs rather than sharp angles. "Original 1920s design," Mrs. Caldwell said, noting my expression. The architect believed that sharp corners trapped negative energy. Every curve in this apartment was planned to encourage positive flow. I walked through the space slowly. The living room was spacious and bright, with 2 tall windows facing what should have been west, but the light streaming through them had the quality of morning sun. The bedroom was cozy, with built-in shelving that curved along the walls like ribs. Even the bathroom fixtures followed the same flowing design philosophy. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. "But why is the rent so low?" Mrs. Caldwell's smile faltered for just a moment. "The previous tenant left suddenly. We're eager to fill the vacancy." "What happened to them?" "Nothing dramatic," she said quickly. "A job transfer, I believe. These things happen." She handed me a lease agreement from her briefcase. "Standard terms. First month and security deposit. You can move in immediately if you'd like." I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why such a desirable apartment was sitting empty, why the rent was so far below market rate, why Mrs. Caldwell seemed so eager to have me sign. But the apartment felt like home in a way no place ever had. The light, the curves, the way sound seemed to settle gently into the corners that weren't quite corners. It all felt right. I signed the lease that afternoon. Moving in was easier than I expected. I didn't own much, a few pieces of furniture, some books, my computer set up. The movers finished in 3 hours, and by evening I was unpacking in my new bedroom, already feeling like I'd lived there for years. That first night, I discovered the apartment's most unusual feature. I'd gone to bed around 11, exhausted from moving. The bedroom was perfectly dark, darker than seemed possible for a downtown apartment. No streetlight filtered through the windows, no glow from neighboring buildings. Just complete, enveloping darkness. I was drifting off when I heard it, a soft, humming sound, like someone singing a lullaby just below the threshold of hearing. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating gently through the floorboards and into my bones. It wasn't unpleasant, quite the opposite. It was the most soothing sound I'd ever heard. Like being wrapped in warm honey, the humming continued all night, weaving through my dreams and making them vivid and strange. I dreamed of walking through endless curved hallways, of rooms that expanded and contracted like breathing lungs, of voices speaking in languages I almost understood. When I woke, I felt more rested than I had in months. The humming became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes it would start as soon as the sun set, other times not, until the early hours of morning. It varied in pitch and rhythm, but it was always there, always soothing. I began to look forward to it, to feel oddly disappointed on the rare nights when it was absent. I settled into a routine quickly. Working from home in the apartment was a dream this strange. Sourceless light was perfect for reading, and the curves seemed to encourage creativity. My productivity soared. I'd never written better marketing copy, never felt more focused or inspired. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice other things. The apartment was always the perfect temperature, regardless of the weather outside. I never touched the thermostat, never opened or closed windows, yet it remained consistently comfortable. The light, too, never seemed to change, whether it was noon or midnight, cloudy or sunny outside. The apartment maintained its gentle, golden glow. I mentioned this to my neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman I'd met in the elevator. She looked at me strangely when I described the consistent lighting. Apartment 4G, she said. Are you sure that's your unit number? Of course I'm sure. I live there, she frowned. I've been in this building for 15 years. There's no apartment for G. I laughed, thinking she was confused. There must be some mistake. My lease clearly says 4G. I showed her my key, with its brass tag marked 4G. That's Mrs. Chen examined the key for a long moment, then shook her head. Very strange. I could have sworn the hallway only went up to 4F. That night, I paid attention to the apartment numbers as I walked to my door. 4A, 4 bytes, 4C, 4D, 4A, 4A, and then, after a gap that seemed longer than it should be, 4G. The numbers were identical to the others, brass digits mounted on dark wood doors. But now that I was looking closely, I noticed that the gap between 4F and 4G was wider than the others, as if there should have been another door in between. I stood in that space, running my hands along the wall. The wallpaper was seamless, the same pattern of subtle geometric shapes that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. But the wall felt different here, warmer and slightly soft to the touch, like living skin. Inside my apartment that night, the humming was louder than usual. It seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, and for the first time, I thought I could almost make out words hidden in the melody. They were in a language I didn't recognize, but the meaning felt clear. Welcome home. You belong here. Stay. I tried to research the building's history, but information was surprisingly scarce. The city records showed that the Meridian had been built in 1923 by an architect named Edmund Thorne, who had died in a construction accident before the building was completed. There were a few newspaper articles about the grand opening, mentioning Thorne's innovative flow-state architecture that eliminated sharp angles to promote harmony and peace. What I couldn't find were any records of apartment 4G. The original building plans, available through the city planning office, showed apartments for A through 4F, with no space for a 7th unit. According to the blueprints, 4F should have been directly across from my door, not down the hall. I called Mrs. Caldwell to ask about the discrepancy. The phone rang and rang before going to an automated voicemail. You have reached Meridian Property Management. Please leave a message, and we will return your call during normal business hours. I left 3 messages over the next week. None were returned. The security guard in the lobby was no help either. When I asked him about Mrs. Caldwell, he looked confused. Property management is handled by Henderson Associates, he said. Has been for 10 years. I don't know any Mrs. Caldwell, but she showed me the apartment. She had keys. He shrugged. Maybe she's new. People come and go. But when I called Henderson Associates, they had no record of a Mrs. Caldwell either. More troubling, they had no record of apartment for G being available for rent. All our 4th floor units are occupied, the receptionist told me, have been for months. Are you sure you have the right building? That night, the humming took on a different quality. Instead of the soothing lullaby I'd grown accustomed to, it sounded almost urgent, like a warning. The pitch rose and fell in patterns that reminded me of someone trying to communicate in Morse code. I lay in bed listening, trying to decode the message. But the meaning stayed just out of reach. I began to notice other changes in the apartment. The curves seemed more pronounced, the walls bowing inward, as if the room were slowly contracting. The sourceless light had developed a slight flicker, like candlelight disturbed by a breeze, and the temperature, while still comfortable, had an odd quality. It felt like the warmth was coming from inside my own body, rather than from the air. Around me, most disturbing were the reflections. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the curved surfaces, the windows, the polished fixtures, even the slight sheen on the painted walls. But when I turned to look directly, there was never anything there. Just my own face, staring back with eyes that seemed darker than I remembered. One evening in late November, I was working at my computer when I heard voices in the hallway. Not unusual sound, carried strangely in the meridian, and I often heard fragments of conversation from other apartments. But these voices were different. They were speaking directly outside my door, and they were talking about me. "He's been here almost 2 months now," a woman's voice said. It sounded like Mrs. Caldwell, but with an odd echo, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Longer than most," replied a man's voice, dry and papery. "Usually they last 3 weeks, maybe 4. This one's different. He's adapting. Look how the room's responding to him." I crept to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. The voices continued, but they seemed to be moving away, their words becoming harder to distinguish. I heard something about the process and full integration before they faded entirely. I waited several minutes, then carefully opened the door. The hallway was empty, lit by the same shadowy sconces as always, but the air smelled different, like ozone after a lightning strike, or the metallic taste that comes before a nosebleed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The humming was so loud it seemed to be coming from inside my head, and the apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer while I wasn't looking. I got up to check, running my hands along the curved surfaces, but everything seemed normal. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was contracting around me like a living thing. I decided to measure the apartment, using a tape measure I'd borrowed from the building's maintenance closet. I carefully recorded the dimensions of each room. The living room was 14 feet by 16 feet, the bedroom 12 by 14, the bathroom 6 by 8, all perfectly normal proportions. The next morning, I measured again. The living room was now 13 feet by 15 feet, the bedroom 11 by 13, the bathroom 6 by 7. I told myself I'd made an error, that I was tired and stressed. But as the days passed, the measurements continued to shrink. By the end of the week, I was losing roughly an inch from each dimension every day. The apartment was definitely getting smaller. What was worse, I didn't seem to mind, despite the objective evidence that something impossible was happening. I felt perfectly content. The apartment still felt like home, still wrapped me in its warm, humming embrace. If anything, the smaller dimensions made it feel more cozy, more protective. I began to spend less time outside. Why leave when everything I needed was here? My work was going better than ever. My sleep was deep and dreamless, and the constant, gentle humming had become as essential to me as breathing. The outside world felt harsh and angular, full of sharp corners and painful lights. My family called less frequently, and when they did, I found their voices grating and foreign. My friends sent fewer messages, then stopped entirely. I didn't miss them. The apartment provided all the companionship I needed, speaking to me in its wordless language of curves and warmth and subsonic songs. By December, the apartment had shrunk to half its original size, but I had shrunk with it. Not physically, I looked the same in mirrors, though my reflection had grown strangely fluid, sometimes showing me from angles that should have been impossible. But mentally, spiritually, I was becoming smaller, more concentrated, more essential. The humming had evolved into something like conversation. I could understand it now, not in words, but in pure meaning, transmitted directly into my consciousness. It told me stories about the other tenants who had lived in 4G. Dozens of them over the decades since Edmund Thorne had died. They were all still here. In a way, their essence absorbed into the walls and floors and curved ceilings. Their consciousness woven into the building's living fabric. But I'm different, I said aloud one evening, speaking to the room itself. I'm still me. The humming paused, then resumed with what felt like gentle laughter. Are you? It seemed to ask. When did you last remember what you were like before? I tried to recall my life before the apartment, but the memories felt thin and colorless, like photographs left too long in sunlight. Had I really been unhappy in those angular spaces, surrounded by sharp corners and harsh fluorescent lights? It seemed impossible that I'd ever lived any other way. The measuring tape now showed the living room as 6 feet by 8 feet, barely large enough for my desk and chair. The bedroom was a cozy 5 by 7, the bathroom a cramped 4 by 5, but I felt no sense of claustrophobia. If anything, the smaller space felt more intimate, more protective. The curves of the walls seemed to pulse gently, like being inside a giant heart. On Christmas Eve, I discovered I could no longer open the door to the hallway. Not because it was locked, but because it no longer seemed to exist. When I looked at the wall where the door should be, I saw only seamless curves, the geometric wallpaper flowing unbroken from floor to ceiling, but I felt no panic, no urge to escape. Why would I want to leave paradise? The humming grew stronger that night, accompanied by other sounds, whispers, sighs, the soft pad of footsteps on carpeted floors. I understood now that they were the voices of my predecessors, the other tenants who had been absorbed into the apartment's embrace. They welcomed me warmly, sharing their own stories of discovery and integration. There was Margaret, a librarian from the 1940s, who had loved the apartment's perfect reading light. Thomas, a jazz musician from the 1960s who had been drawn to its acoustic properties. Sarah, a painter from the 1980s who had been captivated by the way colors seemed more vivid within the curved walls. Dozens of others, each drawn by the apartment's ability to provide exactly what they needed most. But what happened to your bodies? I asked them. What happened to your lives outside? The answer came not in words, but in images, bodies found in empty apartments, peaceful and smiling, as if they had simply chosen to stop living in the outside world. Death certificates citing natural causes, though the deceased were always healthy and young. Families who mourned briefly, then gradually forgot, as if their memories were being gently edited. Is that what will happen to me? Not if you don't want it to, they said. You can stay as you are, conscious and aware, for as long as you like. The apartment will sustain you. The only requirement is that you never try to leave. But I had no desire to leave. The outside world had become as foreign to me as an alien planet here. In my shrinking paradise, I had everything I needed. The curves that cradled me, the light that never hurt my eyes, the humming that sang me to sleep and woke me with whispered promises of eternal peace. January came and went without my noticing. Time moved differently in the apartment now, flowing in loops and eddies like water around stones. Sometimes I would work at my computer for what felt like hours, only to discover that the clock hadn't moved. Other times I would close my eyes for a moment and open them to find that days had passed. The apartment was now small enough that I could touch opposite walls by stretching out my arms, but it still felt spacious, infinite even, as if it's true. Dimensions existed in some other geometry that my shrinking consciousness could navigate with ease. The curves had become so pronounced that the room was nearly spherical, a perfect womb of warm light and gentle sound. My reflection in the curved surfaces showed a face I barely recognized, peaceful, content with eyes that held depths I'd never seen before. I looked younger somehow, as if the years of worry and stress had been smoothed away by the apartment's embrace. My body felt lighter, less substantial, as if I were gradually becoming part of the room's essential architecture. The voices of my predecessors were clearer now, their personalities distinct and vivid. We would have long conversations about art and music and literature, sharing perspectives across decades of experience. They had become my true family, bound together by our common love for this impossible space. "How long have I been here?" I asked them one day or night. It was impossible to tell. "Time enough," they replied. "Long enough to become what you were always meant to be." I realized then that I could no longer remember my name, or what I had done in the outside world, or why I had ever thought those things mattered. There was only the eternal present of the curved room, the endless conversation with my fellow spirits, the perfect harmony of existence without sharp edges or painful light. The apartment had stopped shrinking, or perhaps I had shrunk to match it perfectly. We were the same size now, the same substance, the same eternal moment stretched like taffy through dimensions that had no names in any human language. Sometimes I sense new footsteps in the hallway, outside, though I know the hallway is just another part of the dream now. I feel the apartment stirring with anticipation, preparing to offer itself to another lost soul who needs what only it can provide. The cycle continues, as it has for 100 years, as it will for 100 more, and I am content to be part of that cycle, to add my voice to the gentle humming that draws the lonely and the searching to this place between worlds. There are no corners here to trap negative energy, no sharp edges to cut or wound, only curves that cradle and embrace, light that heals without blinding, and voices that sing lullabies in languages older than words. Close your eyes now, and listen to the rain against your window. Can you hear it? That soft humming underneath. The patter of drops on glass. That's us, singing you to sleep, reminding you that somewhere in the world there are spaces without corners. Rooms that love you back. Apartments that will hold you forever if you just know where to look. Sleep now. Dream of curved walls and gentle light. And if you ever find yourself walking through a downtown building with thick carpets and geometric wallpaper, if you ever see a door marked with a number that shouldn't exist, remember this story. Remember that some homes are not places you live in, but places that live in you. The rain continues to fall, and we continue to sing, and somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, between memory and dream, the apartment waits with infinite patience for the next soul who needs to come home. The bed faced the wrong direction. Settle in now. Pull your blankets close, and let the rain outside become your companion for the next hour. There's something comforting about being warm and safe while water falls in the darkness beyond your walls, isn't there? Tonight, as you close your eyes and feel your breathing slow, I want to tell you about something that happened to me in a small apartment building on the east side of the city, where I learned that sometimes the simplest things, like which way your bed faces, can reveal truths about the world that we're not supposed to know. Let the rhythm of the rain wash away the concerns of your day, and listen as I share the story of how I discovered that my bed faced the wrong direction. I moved into apartment 4B on Meridian Street in late September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, and the air carried that crisp promise of autumn. It was my first place, living alone, a studio apartment with tall windows, hardwood floors, and rent that stretched my budget to its breaking point. But it was mine, and after years of roommates and temporary arrangements, the solitude felt like a gift. The building was old, probably built in the 1920s, with thick walls and the kind of solid construction that made modern apartments feel flimsy by comparison. Mrs. Kowalski, the building manager, was a woman in her 70s who wore cardigans in every season and kept meticulous records of everything from lease agreements to the exact day each tenant's light bulbs burned out. She walked me through the apartment on my first day, pointing out the quirks that came with living in a building that had weathered nearly a century of tenants. The radiator clanked in a specific rhythm each morning at 6:30. The bathroom door stuck unless you lifted it slightly while pushing. The kitchen faucet had to be turned off with just the right amount of pressure, or it would drip all night. But it was when she showed me the bedroom area, really, just an alcove off the main room where my bed would go, that I noticed something odd about her demeanor. She stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the space with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You'll want to position your bed along the north wall," she said, pointing to the wall that backed up against the hallway. "That's the best placement. For, well, for a good night's sleep." It seemed like an odd thing to specify, but I nodded agreeably. The north wall made sense anyway, was the longest wall in the alcove, and it would leave the most open floor space when my bed arrived 2 days later. The delivery men positioned it exactly where Mrs. Kowalski had suggested, with the headboard against the north wall and the foot of the bed pointing toward the windows that faced south. For the first week, everything was perfect. I slept deeply and peacefully, waking refreshed each morning to sunlight streaming through those tall windows. The apartment felt like home in a way that surprised me with its immediacy. I established routines quickly: coffee at the small table by the window, reading in the evening light, falling asleep to the gentle sounds of the city settling into night. But then, I decided to rearrange. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more of a restless feeling that the space could be optimized differently. The bed against the north wall left the alcove feeling cramped, and I thought it might be more open and airy if I rotated everything 90 degrees. On a Saturday morning, fueled by coffee and the satisfaction of improving my living space, I pushed the bed against the east wall instead. The change seemed minor. I was still in the same room, looking at the same walls, breathing the same air. But that night, something felt wrong. I couldn't pinpoint what it was initially. The bed was comfortable, the apartment was quiet, the temperature was the same as always. But as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I became increasingly aware of a sensation I'd never experienced before. The feeling that I was oriented incorrectly in space, like a compass needle that couldn't find true north. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sense of discomfort that I attributed to the novelty of the new arrangement. But as the hours passed and sleep continued to elude me, the feeling intensified. It was as if the room itself was trying to tell me something, trying to correct my position through some kind of gravitational pull I couldn't understand. I finally fell asleep around 4 in the morning, only to wake up an hour later with the strangest dream clinging to my consciousness. I had been lying in my bed, but instead of my apartment walls around me, I was surrounded by an endless corridor that stretched in both directions beyond the reach of sight. The walls were lined with doors, hundreds of them, all identical except for small brass numbers that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the dream, I knew with absolute certainty that I was in the wrong place, that my bed had been moved to a location where it didn't belong, and that by sleeping in the wrong direction, I had somehow opened a door that should have remained closed. I woke with my heart racing and my skin damp with perspiration. The apartment looked exactly as it should. My furniture, my belongings, morning light beginning to creep through the windows. But the feeling from the dream lingered, that sense of being displaced, of occupying space that wasn't quite meant for me. Over the next few days, I tried to dismiss the experience as the product of stress and adjustment to living alone. But the dreams continued, each one more vivid and disturbing than the last. Sometimes I was in the corridor with its endless doors. Other times, I found myself in rooms that looked almost like my apartment, but were wrong in subtle ways. The windows faced the wrong direction. The walls were a slightly different color. The furniture was arranged in mirror image of how I'd left it. And always, there was the persistent feeling that I needed to move my bed back to where it belonged, but I was stubborn. The rational Part of my mind insisted that the position of furniture couldn't possibly affect my dreams or my sleep quality. I was an adult, educated, grounded in reality. I wasn't going to rearrange my living space based on superstition and anxiety dreams. That resolve lasted until the night I woke up to find someone else in my bed. It was 3:17 in the morning, according to the digital clock on my nightstand, and I came awake with the immediate, undeniable awareness that I wasn't alone. There was another person lying next to me, so close I could feel their warmth through the blankets. Hear their slow, steady breathing in the darkness. My first thought was that someone had broken into my apartment, that I was in danger and needed to call for help. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the windows, I realized the truth was far more unsettling than a simple break-in. The person next to me was me. She was lying on her side, facing away from me, but I could see enough of her profile to know with horrible certainty that I was looking at myself. The same hair, the same build, wearing the same pajamas I had put on before bed. But she was sleeping peacefully, breathing with the deep rhythm of someone lost in pleasant dreams, while I lay rigid with terror beside her. I wanted to reach out and touch her, to confirm that what I was seeing was real, but some instinct deeper than thought kept my hands frozen at my sides. Instead, I lay perfectly still, watching this other version of myself sleep, trying to understand what was happening to me. As the minutes passed, I began to notice other details that made the scene even more impossible. The other me was lying on the side of the bed closest to the north wall, the position I would have been in if I hadn't moved the bed. She was sleeping in the orientation that Mrs. Kowalski had recommended, while I was displaced to the wrong side, the wrong direction, the wrong version of the space. When I finally worked up the courage to whisper hello, the other me stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Instead, she smiled in her sleep and murmured something I couldn't quite make out. The sound of my own voice speaking words I hadn't chosen sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I lay motionless until dawn, watching my doppelganger breathe, occasionally shifting position, but never waking. When the first light of morning began to brighten the windows, she simply faded away, becoming translucent and then invisible, like mist dissolving in sunlight. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't imagine trying to function normally after what I'd experienced. Couldn't fathom sitting in meetings and responding to emails when reality itself seemed to have become unreliable. Instead, I spent the day researching everything I could find about the building, about Meridian Street, about anything that might explain what was happening to me. What I discovered made me wish I'd listened to Mrs. Kowalski from the beginning. The building had a history of unusual incidents, though they were scattered across decades and described in language that suggested the witnesses hadn't been taken entirely seriously. A tenant in the 1950s who complained about displacement episodes before moving out suddenly in the middle of the night. A woman in the 1970s who insisted that her apartment was shifting between versions of itself and demanded to break her. A man in the 1990s who filed multiple reports with the police about unauthorized occupants who appeared and disappeared from his unit. All of them had been living in an apartment. For B, all of them had complained to Mrs. Kowalski's predecessors about feeling disoriented and displaced, and all of them, according to the scattered records I could find, had moved their beds away from the north wall. That evening, I worked up the courage to knock on Mrs. Kowalski's door. She answered wearing one of her ubiquitous cardigans, this one a soft gray that matched her hair. When she saw my expression, her face immediately grew concerned. "You moved your bed," she said before I could speak. It wasn't a question. I nodded, suddenly feeling like a child who had been caught breaking an important rule. "Mrs. Kowalski, what's happening in my apartment? What's wrong with that room?" She gestured for me to come inside, leading me to a small, sitting room filled with furniture that looked like it had been carefully maintained since the Eisenhower administration. She poured tea from a china service and settled into a chair across from me, her expression grave. "The building is old," she said, choosing her words carefully. "And in old buildings, sometimes the boundaries between spaces become flexible. Apartment for B sits at what you might call a junction point, a place where the normal rules of occupancy don't always hold." What does that mean? It means that the apartment exists in multiple states simultaneously, she explained, stirring her tea with deliberate precision. Think of it like a radio that can pick up several stations at once. Most of the time, the signal is clear and you hear only one station. But if the antenna is positioned incorrectly, you start getting interference from the others. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. The bed position is like the antenna. Exactly. She nodded approvingly. When the bed faces north, you're tuned into the primary signal, your apartment, as it exists in this reality. But when you change the orientation, you start picking up the other versions. The other possibilities of what that space could be. Other versions of me? Other versions of the tenant who occupies that space, she corrected gently. Sometimes it's you. Sometimes it's someone else entirely. Sometimes it's the same person, but living a different life, making different choices. The apartment holds space for all of these possibilities, but they're only supposed to exist one at a time. I set down my teacup with hands that weren't entirely steady. "How long has this been happening?" "Since the building was constructed," Mrs. Kowalski said. "The architect didn't know what he was doing when he designed that particular unit. He created a space that exists at the intersection of several, let's call them, dimensional streams. Most of the time, it's perfectly safe, as long as the occupant follows the basic rule about bed placement. And if they don't," her expression grew darker. "The boundaries start to break down. The different versions of the space begin to bleed into each other. Usually, it's just dreams and minor displacement experiences. But if it continues long enough, if the interference becomes too strong..." She trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air like smoke. "What happens then?" "The occupant becomes unstuck," she said quietly. "They start existing in multiple versions simultaneously, never fully present in any one reality. They become displaced, not just in space, but in possibility itself." I thought about the other me I'd seen in my bed, sleeping peacefully in the position I should have been occupying. Is it too late? Have I already become unstuck? Mrs. Kowalski studied my face carefully, as if she could read the degree of my displacement in my features. "Not yet," she said finally, "but you need to move your bed back tonight. And once you do, you can never change its position again. The space will remember that it's been disturbed, and it will be more sensitive to future disruptions." I thanked her and returned to my apartment with a new understanding of why the rent had been so affordable, why the previous tenant had left so suddenly, why Mrs. Kowalski had been so specific about the bed placement on my first day. I spent the evening pushing the bed back against the north wall, arranging and rearranging until it was positioned exactly as it had been originally. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. No dreams of endless corridors, no sense of displacement, no other versions of myself sharing my space. Just deep, peaceful sleep in a bed that faced the right direction. But even now, months later, I sometimes catch glimpses of the other possibilities out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving in my peripheral vision that doesn't match my own movements. The reflection in my bathroom mirror that seems to lag a split second behind my actual motions. The feeling, when I'm half asleep, that someone else is breathing in rhythm with me. Mrs. Kowalski was right about the space being more sensitive after being disturbed. I've learned to live with the occasional reminders that my apartment exists at the intersection of multiple realities. That every night, when I go to sleep, I'm choosing which version of myself wakes up in the morning. I've also learned to be very Very careful about furniture placement. Every chair, every table, every lamp is positioned exactly where it feels most stable, most grounded in this particular version of reality. I've become a student of my own space, learning to read the subtle signs that indicate when the boundaries are strong and when they're beginning to thin. Sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and the rain is falling like it is now, I wonder about the other versions of myself and the other versions of my apartment. Are they happy? Do they know that they're sharing space with alternatives of themselves? Do they sometimes catch glimpses of me the way I sometimes see them? I wonder if there's a version where I never moved the bed at all, where I lived in blissful ignorance of the junction point beneath my feet. Or perhaps there's a version where I ignored Mrs. Kowalski's warnings entirely, where I moved furniture freely and eventually became so displaced that I exist everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. But mostly, I'm grateful to be here, in this version, sleeping in a bed that faces the right direction in a room that knows which reality it belongs to. I've come to understand that some boundaries exist for our protection, that some rules are written not to limit us, but to keep us safely anchored in the world we're meant to inhabit. The rain continues to fall outside your window, and as you feel sleep approaching, remember this. Pay attention to the spaces you occupy, the directions you face, the way your environment makes you feel. Most of the time, your instincts about placement and position are just preferences. But sometimes, very rarely, they're messages from the deeper architecture of reality itself. Gentle warnings about boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, and orientations that must be maintained tonight. As you settle into your own bed, take a moment to appreciate that it faces the right direction, that you're sleeping in the version of your room that belongs fully in this world. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress, the warmth of your blankets, the solid presence of walls that know exactly where they are in space and time. And if you ever wake up with the feeling that something has shifted, that your bed is oriented differently than it should be, trust that feeling. Sometimes the smallest adjustments are the most important ones. The tiny corrections that keep us grounded in the reality we've chosen to call home. Sleep well, and dream of spaces that know their own boundaries, of furniture that stays exactly where it belongs, of beds that face the right direction in rooms that exist in only one world at a time. The house with no back door. Settle back into your pillows and let the rain outside become part of this story. Close your eyes and breathe deeply, feeling the comfort of your bed, the safety of walls around you, the certainty of doors that lead exactly where they should. Tonight, I want to tell you about a house where doors were more complicated than they appeared, where the simple act of leaving became an impossible puzzle that I'm still trying to solve. Listen to the rain as it falls against your window, steady and reliable, the kind of sound that promises the world is still turning as it should. But remember, as you drift toward sleep, that some houses have their own weather, their own rules, their own ways of keeping the people inside exactly where they belong. The house I'm going to tell you about looked perfectly normal from the street. Red brick, white trim, a small front porch with 2 rocking chairs that someone had painted sage green. It sat on Maple Street like dozens of other houses, ordinary and unremarkable. The kind of place where families raised children and grew old together, where the most exciting event might be a new coat of paint or a rosebush blooming earlier than expected. I should have known better than to trust something so aggressively normal. I found the house on a Tuesday in March, scrolling through rental listings while rain drummed against the windows of my temporary apartment. I had been looking for weeks, growing increasingly frustrated with places that were either too expensive or too small or too far from my new job at the university library. The housing market was brutal, and I was beginning to think I might have to consider a roommate situation when the listing appeared. Charming 2-bedroom house for rent. Quiet neighborhood, hardwood floors, updated kitchen. Perfect for someone seeking peace and privacy. No pets, non-smoker preferred, references required. The rent was reasonable, almost suspiciously so, but the photos showed a house that was clean and well-maintained. Sunlight streamed through windows that someone had recently washed, highlighting gleaming wood floors and fresh paint. The kitchen was small but functional, with white cabinets and a farmhouse sink that looked like it had been installed recently. I called the number in the listing and spoke to a woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who had a voice like warm honey and a laugh that made me feel like I was talking to a favorite grandmother. She explained that the house had belonged to her late husband's family for generations, and she was looking for the right person to take care of it. "It's a special place," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "The kind of house that takes care of you if you take care of it." "Would you be interested in seeing it this weekend?" Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that makes you believe in fresh starts and new possibilities. I drove to Maple Street with a thermos of coffee and a good feeling about the whole arrangement. The neighborhood was exactly as advertised: quiet, tree-lined, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and children could play safely in front yards. The house looked even better in person than it had in the photos. The front porch was welcoming, with those sage green rocking chairs positioned to catch the morning sun. Flower boxes under the windows held the brown remnants of last year's plantings, waiting for spring to bring them back to life. Everything about the place suggested stability, continuity, the kind of home where you could settle in and stay for years. Mrs. Hartwell was waiting for me. A small woman in her 70s, with silver hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a lavender cardigan that had seen better days and carried a ring of keys that jangled softly when she moved. "You must be Sarah," she said, extending a hand that was warm and dry despite the cool morning air. "I'm so glad you could make it. I have a feeling about you, dear. I think you and this house are going to get along beautifully." She led me up the front steps and unlocked the door with a key that was older and more ornate than the others on her ring. The front door opened into a small foyer with a coat closet and a narrow staircase leading to the second floor. To the left was the living room, spacious and bright, with windows that faced the street and let in generous amounts of natural light. The previous tenant was very quiet, Mrs. Hartwell explained as we walked through the rooms. A lovely young man, very responsible. He lived here for almost 3 years before he decided to move closer to his family. Left the place in beautiful condition, as you can see. The kitchen was everything the photos had promised: updated, but not modernized to the point of losing its character. The countertops were butcher block, worn smooth by years of use, and the appliances were newer, but not so new that they looked out of place. A window over the sink looked out into the backyard, where I could see a small garden area and what appeared to be a tool shed. "The backyard is lovely in summer," Mrs. Hartwell said, following my gaze. "Perfect for someone who enjoys gardening. There's a door in the kitchen that leads right out to the garden, very convenient for herbs and vegetables." I looked around the kitchen, noting the refrigerator, the stove, the dishwasher, but I didn't see any door leading outside. The wall where I would have expected to find a back door was occupied by a tall pantry cabinet and a small breakfast nook. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I don't see the back door you mentioned." Mrs. Hartwell paused in her description of the kitchen's features and looked at me with a slight frown, as if I had said something puzzling. "Oh, it's there, dear. You'll find it when you need it." Houses like this one have a way of revealing their secrets gradually. She said it with such confidence that I wondered if I had simply missed something obvious. Old houses could have unusual layouts, doors tucked into corners or hidden behind furniture. I made a mental note to look more carefully later. The rest of the tour was straightforward. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, both good-sized, and a bathroom that had been updated recently. The hardwood floors throughout the house were in excellent condition, and everything felt solid and well-maintained. It was exactly the kind of place I had been hoping to find. "I'd like to rent it," I told Mrs. Hartwell as we finished the tour. "When would I be able to move in?" Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Oh, wonderful. I knew you would be perfect for this house. You can move in as soon as you like, dear. I'll have the lease drawn up this week." We shook hands on the front porch, and she gave me a spare key so I could come back and take measurements for furniture. As I drove away, I felt a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in months. Finally, I had found a place where I could settle in and make a real home. I moved in on a Thursday, hiring a small moving company to transport my belongings from the temporary apartment across town. The movers were efficient and careful, and by evening I was surrounded by boxers in a house that was officially mine for the next year. Mrs. Hartwell had left a bottle of wine on the kitchen counter with a note that said, "Welcome home, dear. I hope you'll be very happy here." The first few days were spent unpacking and arranging furniture, the normal process of turning a house into a home. I set up my bedroom upstairs, arranged my books in the living room, and organized the kitchen to suit my cooking habits. Everything felt right, comfortable, like I had been living there for years, instead of days. It wasn't until the following Tuesday that I realized I still hadn't found the back door. I had been washing dishes at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard and thinking about the garden I might plant in the spring. The previous tenant had left behind a few tools in the shed, and I was eager to explore what was out there. But when I finished the dishes and looked around the kitchen for the door Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned, I couldn't find anything that resembled an exit to the backyard. I searched methodically, checking every wall, every corner, every space where a door might reasonably be located. The kitchen was not large, and there were only so many places where an entrance could be hidden. I found the front door, of course, and a side door that led to a small mudroom, and then to the driveway. But there was no back door, no way to step directly from the kitchen into the garden. I called Mrs. Hartwell. "Oh, you haven't found it yet," she said, and I could hear that warm laugh in her voice. "Don't worry, dear. It takes some people longer than others. The house will show you when you're ready." "Mrs. Hartwell, I've looked everywhere. Are you sure there's a back door? Maybe you're thinking of a different house." "Oh no, dear. I've been managing this property for 15 years. There's definitely a back door. Perhaps you're just not looking in the right way. Sometimes we see only what we expect to see." After I hung up, I wondered if Mrs. Hartwell was showing signs of confusion or memory loss. It happened sometimes with elderly people, especially when they were managing multiple properties. But she had seemed so sharp during our initial meeting, so certain about the details of the house. That weekend, I decided to approach the problem I would measure the interior dimensions of the house and compare them to the exterior dimensions, looking for any space that might be unaccounted for. If there was a back door, there had to be some evidence of its existence. I started with the kitchen, measuring from the front of the house to the back wall. The interior measurement was exactly what I expected based on the exterior dimensions. There was no missing space, no hidden area where a door might be concealed. I checked the walls for any signs of recent construction or renovation, looking for seams in the paint or variations in the wallpaper that might indicate a door had been sealed up. Nothing. I expanded my search to the rest of the house, measuring every room, checking every wall, looking for any anomaly that might explain Mrs. Hartwell's insistence that there was a back door. I found nothing unusual, no evidence of hidden passages or concealed entrances. The house was exactly what it appeared to be, a straightforward, well-maintained home with one front door and one side door. But I kept thinking about the backyard. The garden area I could see from the kitchen window. How did the previous tenant access it? How did anyone maintain the plants or use the tools in the shed? There had to be a way to get from the house to the backyard without walking all the way around the building. On Monday, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of looking for the door from inside the house, I would search for it from the backyard. I walked around to the back of the house, following a narrow path that ran along the property line. The backyard was larger than it had appeared from the kitchen window, with mature trees and established flower beds that showed evidence of careful tending. I examined the back wall of the house, looking for any sign of a door or entrance. The brick was uniform, unbroken by any openings, except for the windows on the first and second floors. I checked the foundation, the trim around the windows, even the areas where ivy had grown up the wall. There was no door, no evidence that there had ever been a door. But as I stood there in the backyard, looking up at the house that was supposed to be my home, I felt a strange sense of displacement. The windows I was looking at didn't match the rooms I knew were inside. The kitchen window was there, exactly where I expected it to be, but next to it was another window that I had never noticed from inside the house. I went back inside and looked around the kitchen more carefully. The window over the sink was the only window in the room. There was no second window, no space where another window could logically be located, but I had seen it clearly from the backyard. A window with white trim and clean glass that reflected the afternoon sky. That night, I dreamed about doors. I dreamed I was walking through my house, opening door after door, but each one led to the same room I had just left. I would step through a doorway, expecting to find myself in the living room, only to discover I was back in the kitchen. I would try the front door, certain it would take me outside, but it opened into the upstairs hallway. Every door was a lie, every exit a deception. I woke up feeling disoriented, unsure for a moment where I was or how I had gotten there. The house around me felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, larger somehow, as if rooms had been added while I slept. I could hear rain against the windows, gentle but persistent, the kind of sound that usually helped me sleep. But underneath the rain, I could hear something else. Footsteps, soft and careful, moving through the house below me. Someone was walking through my kitchen, my living room, testing doors and windows with the quiet patience of someone who had all the time in the world. I lay still, listening, trying to decide if I should investigate or pretend I hadn't heard anything. The footsteps paused directly below my bedroom, and I could almost feel someone standing there, looking up at the ceiling, aware of my presence, just as I was aware of theirs. Then the footsteps moved away, continuing their circuit of the house, and I heard the soft sound of a door opening and closing. Not the front door or the side door. I knew those sounds already. This was different, quieter, like a door that fit perfectly in its frame and closed without even a whisper of complaint. In the morning, I checked every door in the house. The front door was locked, just as I had left it. The side door was locked as well, with no sign that anyone had tampered with it during the night. I examined the windows, looking for any indication that someone had tried to open them from outside. Everything was secure, undisturbed, exactly as it should be. But when I looked out the kitchen window, I could see footprints in the soft earth of the backyard. Small, neat prints that led from the back of the house to the garden area, then returned to the house and disappeared at the brick wall where no door existed. I called Mrs. Hartwell again. Someone was in my backyard last night, I told her. I heard footsteps in the house, and this morning there are prints in the garden. Do you have any idea who might have a key? There was a long pause before she answered. Oh dear, you're having some adjustment difficulties, aren't you? The house is just trying to get to know you. Give it time, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm serious. Someone was in my house last night. If there's another tenant or a caretaker who has access, I need to know about it. There's no one else, Sarah. Just you and the house. Some houses are more interactive than others. This one has always been special that way. The previous tenant understood that. After I hung up, I wondered if I had made a mistake renting from Mrs. Hartwell. She seemed to have a very casual attitude toward what should be a serious security concern. but the lease was signed, and I had already paid the first month's rent and security deposit. I would have to find a way to make the situation work. That afternoon, I decided to take a more practical approach to the problem. If someone was getting into my house through a door I couldn't find, I would install a security system, cameras, motion sensors, alarms, whatever it took to identify the intruder and secure my home. I'd spent the evening researching security companies and making appointments for estimates. It felt good to be taking action, to be addressing the problem directly, instead of relying on Mrs. Hartwell's vague assurances. Whatever was happening in my house, I would get to the bottom of it. The first security consultant arrived the next morning. A serious young man named David, who carried a tablet and measured everything twice. He walked through the house systematically, noting entry points and potential vulnerabilities. "You've got good sight lines throughout the main floor," he said, making notes on his tablet. "The windows are secure, and the doors are solid. We can set up a basic system with sensors on all the entry points and a couple of cameras for the main areas." "What about the back door?" I asked. "The one that leads to the backyard." David looked up from his tablet with a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry, what back door? I don't see any rear entrance." I walked into the kitchen and pointed toward the backyard. "The landlord mentioned there was a door that leads directly to the garden. I haven't been able to find it, but someone was in the backyard last night, and I heard them in the house." David examined the kitchen carefully, checking the walls and looking for any sign of a concealed entrance. "Ma'am, there's no back door here. The only entrances are the front door and the side door, I already noted." "Are you sure you heard someone inside the house?" I showed him the footprints in the backyard, but even as I pointed them out, I could see that they looked different in the daylight. Smaller, more delicate, like they might have been made by a child or a very small adult. They also seemed older, as if they had been there for days rather than hours. "Those could be from anyone," David said diplomatically. "A neighbor's kid, someone who cut through your yard." I wouldn't worry too much about it, but I was worrying about it. I was worrying about a lot of things, including my own perception of reality. Was I remembering conversations with Mrs. Hartwell correctly? Had she actually mentioned a back door, or had I imagined that detail? Was I hearing footsteps in the night, or was I just adjusting to the normal sounds of an old house? That night, instead of going to bed at my usual time, I decided to stay awake and listen. I made coffee and settled into a chair in the living room where I could see both the front door and the entrance to the kitchen. If someone was moving through my house, I would see them. The rain started around midnight, gentle at first, then building to a steady rhythm that would have been soothing under other circumstances. I sat in the darkness, listening to the water against the windows and the subtle sounds of the house settling around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the eaves, every distant sound of traffic seemed magnified in the quiet. At 2 in the morning, I heard the footsteps. They started in the kitchen, soft and careful, moving across the floor with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I could hear them clearly, despite the rain. Footsteps that belonged to someone who was trying not to be heard but couldn't quite manage complete silence. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, and moved toward the kitchen. The footsteps paused. When I got close, as if the person making them was aware of my approach, I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sound that might tell me where the intruder was hiding. Then I heard it. The soft sound of a door opening and closing. Not the front door, or the side door, but some other door, some entrance I had never found despite my systematic searches. The footsteps resumed, fainter now, as if they were moving away from the house. I rushed to the kitchen and turned on the lights, flooding the room with harsh white illumination. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The chairs were pushed neatly under the table, the counters were clean, the windows were locked, but the air felt different, charged with the presence of someone who had just been there. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. circling the house in the rain, looking for any sign of the intruder. The backyard was empty, but I could see fresh footprints in the mud, leading from the back of the house to the garden and then disappearing at the brick wall. I stood there in the rain, staring at the wall where the footprints ended, trying to understand what I was seeing. The prints were clear and fresh, definitely made within the last few minutes, but they stopped at a solid brick wall, as if the person who made them had simply walked through the building materials and disappeared. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching the rain wash away the evidence of whatever had happened in my backyard. By morning, the footprints were gone, and I was left with nothing but my own increasingly unreliable memories and a growing sense that the house was more complicated than it appeared. Mrs. Hartwell called me that afternoon. "How are you settling in, dear?" she asked, her voice warm and grandmotherly as always. "I hope you're finding everything you need. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you something directly. Is there another tenant in this house? Someone who has access to areas I don't know about?" "Oh dear, you're still having trouble with the back door, aren't you? I should have explained this more clearly when you moved in. The house has its own way of doing things, and it takes time to adjust to the routine." "What routine? What are you talking about?" The previous tenant had the same experience when he first moved in. Confusion about the layout, sounds he couldn't explain, the feeling that he wasn't quite alone. But eventually, he learned to work with the house instead of against it. He was very happy here. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think there might be someone living in the house who shouldn't be here. Someone who knows about entrances that I can't find. This is a serious matter. Sarah, dear, I need you to trust me. There's no one else in the house, but the house itself is special. It has its own personality, its own needs." The previous tenant understood that. He learned to be patient, too. Let the house show him what he needed to see when he was ready to see it. And what happened to the previous tenant? Where did he go? There was a long pause before Mrs. Hartwell answered. "He found what he was looking for, dear. He found the door he needed." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen, looking out at the backyard and trying to decide what to do. I could break the lease and move out, but that would mean admitting defeat and losing the security deposit. I could insist that Mrs. Hartwell provide a more detailed explanation of what was happening, but I suspected she had already told me everything she was going to tell me, or I could try to understand the house on its own terms, the way the previous tenant apparently had. That evening, instead of fighting the strangeness of my situation, I decided to embrace it. I made dinner and set 2 places at the kitchen table, one for myself and one for whatever presence seemed to share the house with me. I cooked more than I could eat, leaving the extra food on the second plate. "I don't know who you are," I said, to the empty chair across from me, "but if you're going to be walking around my house at night, we might as well get acquainted." I ate my dinner in companionable silence, occasionally glancing at the second plate to see if anything had changed. The food remained untouched, but I could feel a presence in the room, a sense of someone listening, considering, maybe even approving of my new approach. After dinner, I didn't clear the second plate. I left it on the table and went to bed, curious to see what would happen during the night. I woke up to the sound of rain and the familiar footsteps in the kitchen, but this time, instead of feeling frightened or defensive, I felt oddly comforted. The footsteps were gentle, considerate, the kind of sounds made by someone who was trying not to disturb a sleeping household. In the morning, the second plate was empty. I began setting 2 places for every meal, cooking extra food, leaving it out like an offering to whatever presence shared my house. The food was always gone by morning, and in return, the nighttime footsteps became less intrusive, more like the sounds of a considerate roommate than an unwelcome intruder. I stopped looking for the back door. Instead, I began to notice other things about the house, the way certain rooms felt warmer or cooler depending on the time of day. The way shadows fell in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. The way the rain sounded different when it hit the windows, almost like it was trying to communicate something. I started spending more time in the backyard, tending to the garden, using the tools in the shed. I never found the door that would have made these trips convenient, but I stopped caring about convenience. I would walk around the house, enter through the side door, and accept that some things didn't have to make logical sense to be true. The house began to feel like home in a way I had never experienced before. Not just a place where I lived, but a place that was actively involved in my life. A place that anticipated my needs and tried to meet them. When I was sad, the rooms seemed to hold me more gently. When I was happy, the light through the windows seemed brighter and more welcoming. I stopped calling Mrs. Hartwell with complaints and started calling her with questions about the house's history, the previous tenants, the stories that had accumulated in the rooms over the decades. She seemed pleased by my change in attitude and began sharing details she had never mentioned before. The house was built in 1923, she told me during one of our conversations. The original owner was a man named Thomas Hartwell, my husband's grandfather. He was an architect, and he designed the house himself. Very particular about how it should be laid out, how the rooms should flow together, and the back door. Oh, Thomas was especially particular about that. He said every house needed a back door, but not every house needed to show it to everyone. He believed some entrances should be earned, not just given. As the weeks passed, I began to understand what she meant. The house was teaching me, gradually and patiently, how to see beyond the obvious, how to find what I needed when I needed it. I learned to trust my intuition instead of my eyes, to feel my way through problems instead of trying to solve them logically. And one morning, in late spring, I found the back door. I was standing in the kitchen, looking out at the garden, where I had planted tomatoes and herbs, when I noticed that the light was falling differently than usual. The shadows on the wall had shifted, revealing what looked like the faint outline of a door frame. I walked over to the wall and placed my hand against it, feeling along the edges of what might have been a door. The wall was solid, but as I pressed my palm against it, I could feel warmth radiating from the other side, as if the sun was shining directly on the surface. I closed my eyes and concentrated, trying to sense what was beyond the wall, what lay between me and the garden. I could see through the window. When I opened my eyes, the door was there, not a new door, but an old door that looked like it had always been part of the house. The wood was weathered and worn, painted the same white as the kitchen trim, with a brass handle that was warm to the touch. It fit so perfectly into the wall that I couldn't understand how I had missed it for so many months. I turned the handle, and the door opened easily, revealing the backyard I had come to know so well. The garden was exactly as I had left it, with the tomato plants beginning to show their first flowers, and the herbs growing thick and fragrant in the morning sun. I stepped through the door, and immediately felt the difference. This wasn't just a convenient entrance to the backyard. This was a threshold between two ways of being, two ways of understanding what home could mean. When I stepped through the door, I was still in the same place, but I was also somewhere else, somewhere that existed between the house and the garden, between the inside and the outside, between what I had expected and what I had discovered. I spent the rest of the morning moving back and forth through the door, marveling at its presence, grateful for its existence. The house had finally revealed its secret, had finally trusted me with its most important feature. I was no longer a temporary tenant or an unwelcome intruder. I was part of the house's story, and it was part of mine. That evening, I sat only one place at the kitchen table. The presence that had shared my house for so many months was still there, but it no longer felt like a separate entity. It felt like part of the house itself, part of the walls and floors and windows that had become my home. We were all connected now, all part of the same story, all learning to exist together in the space between what is and what might be. I have been living in the house for 2 years now, and I have never been happier. The back door is always there, when I need it, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in other rooms, always leading exactly where I need to go. The house continues to teach me, to show me new possibilities, new ways of understanding what it means to be at home. Mrs. Hartwell visits occasionally, and we have tea in the garden, discussing the house's moods and preferences, like old friends sharing gossip about a mutual acquaintance. She tells me I remind her of Thomas Hartwell, the original owner, someone who understood that houses are more than just buildings, that they are living things with their own personalities and needs. The previous tenant never quite got the hang of it, she mentioned during her last visit. He was always fighting the house, always trying to make it conform to his expectations, instead of learning to work with it. Eventually, he gave up and moved out. Where did he go? Oh, he found another house. One with a back door that was always in the same place, always leading to the same backyard. Some people prefer that kind of predictability. I nodded, understanding. Now why Mrs. Hartwell had been so confident that I would be right for this house. She had seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. A willingness to be patient, to trust, to let mystery be mystery instead of insisting on explanation. The rain is falling outside as I tell you this story. The same gentle rain that has been falling on this house for almost a century. It sounds different now than it did when I first moved in. Less like noise and more like music. Less like chaos and more like conversation. Listen to the rain outside your window and remember that some doors are not meant to be found immediately. Some doors reveal themselves only when we are ready to walk through them, only when we have learned to trust the walls that hold them, only when we understand that home is not just a place we live, but a place that lives with us. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain carry you toward sleep, toward dreams of houses that know your name and doors that open exactly when you need them to. And if you ever find yourself in a house that seems to have no back door, remember to be patient. The door is there, waiting for you to discover it, waiting for you to understand that the most important entrances are the ones we have to earn. The house is still teaching me, still showing me new possibilities, still opening doors I never knew existed. And I am grateful, every day, to be part of its story. To be someone who finally learned to trust the mystery, instead of trying to solve it. Some doors lead exactly where you expect them to. Others lead exactly where you need to go. The difference is everything. The mirror fogged with a handprint. Good evening. I hope you found a comfortable place to rest tonight. Somewhere warm and quiet, where the rain can sing you toward sleep. I have something to share with you. A story that's been weighing on my mind for months now. It's about mirrors and fog, and the strange ways that some places remember things they shouldn't be able to remember. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let the sound of rain fill the spaces between my words, and drift with me into this memory that still haunts my quiet moments. I moved into the Belmont apartments last spring, drawn by their vintage charm and surprisingly reasonable rent. The building dated back to the 1950s. All terrazzo floors and mint green tiles, with those wonderful large windows that filled every room with natural light. My unit, 3A, had been recently renovated but maintained its mid-century character. Curved doorways, built-in shelving, and a bathroom that was a perfect time capsule of American design from 7 decades past. The bathroom was what sold me on the place. It was larger than most modern apartments offer, with pale pink tiles covering the walls from floor to ceiling, a deep cast iron tub, and an enormous mirror that dominated the wall above the vanity. The mirror was original to the building, the landlord told me proudly, a heavy piece of silvered glass with beveled edges, mounted in a frame of brushed chrome that had developed a lovely patina over the decades. What struck me most about that mirror was how it seemed to hold light, even in the evening when the bathroom's single overhead fixture cast harsh shadows everywhere else. The glass had a depth to it, a quality that made reflections appear softer. more forgiving than they had any right to be. I settled into my new routine quickly. Morning coffee by the large living room windows, evening baths in that magnificent tub, and always that moment of catching my reflection in the mirror as I brushed my teeth before bed. The apartment felt peaceful, lived in the best possible way, as if decades of contentment had soaked into the walls. It was 3 weeks after I'd moved in when I first noticed something unusual about the mirror. I was running a hot shower after a particularly long day at work, and as the bathroom filled with steam, I watched the mirror fog over completely, as mirrors do. But as the condensation formed, I could see what looked like a handprint appearing in the fog, not being pressed from my side of the glass, but emerging from within the mirror itself, as if someone on the other side were pressing their palm against the back of the glass. The print was small, delicate, a woman's hand, I thought, or perhaps a child's. It remained visible for only a few seconds before the fog shifted and obscured it completely. When I wiped the mirror clean with my towel, there was no trace of the print, no residue or marking on the glass itself. I convinced myself it had been an optical illusion, a trick of the steam and the bathroom's lighting. But the next evening, when I ran another hot shower, the handprint appeared again in exactly the same spot on the mirror's surface. This time, I watched more carefully, timing its appearance. The print emerged about 30 seconds after the mirror began to fog, always in the lower left quadrant of the glass, always the same size and shape. Over the following days, I began to pay closer attention to the mirror during my daily routines. In normal conditions, it reflected everything perfectly: my face, the bathroom behind me, the window's light streaming in. But when fog or steam clouded its surface, that handprint would appear, sometimes accompanied by what looked like other marks, the suggestion of fingers pressed against glass, or the outline of a face leaning close to the mirror's surface. I found myself taking longer showers, running hot water until the small bathroom became thick with steam, just to watch the patterns emerge in the condensation. The handprint was always there, but other shapes came and went, sometimes clear, sometimes just hints of presence that could have been imagination. After 2 weeks of observing this phenomenon, I decided to research the building's history. The Belmont had been constructed in 1953 as luxury housing for young professionals and small families. I spent hours in the city library's archives, scrolling through old newspapers and building records, looking for anything that might explain what I was witnessing. What I found made my evening observations take on a more somber tone. In 1967, a young woman named Catherine Mills had lived in apartment 3A, my apartment. She was 24 years old, recently divorced, working as a secretary downtown. According to the newspaper reports I found, Catherine had been discovered in her bathroom, having apparently slipped and fallen while stepping out of the tub. The coroner's report indicated she had struck her head on the sink and died almost instantly. The newspaper article was brief, buried on page 7 of the local section, but it included a photograph of Catherine taken at some office Christmas party the year before her death. She was small and slight, with delicate hands that would have been just the right size to make the print I'd been seeing in my mirror. That evening, I approached my shower routine with a mixture of anticipation and unease. As the bathroom filled with steam and the mirror began to fog, I spoke aloud for the first time. "Catherine, is that you trying to communicate?" The handprint appeared right on schedule, but this time it seemed more distinct, more deliberate. As I watched, other marks began to form in the condensation, what looked like letters, though they were reversed and difficult to read in the shifting fog. I grabbed my phone and took photographs, but the images never captured what I could see with my naked eye. The camera seemed unable to register the subtle variations in the condensation that formed these ghostly messages. Over the next several weeks, I developed a routine of sorts with Catherine's presence. Each evening, I would run hot water until the mirror fogged completely, then wait and watch as her handprint appeared. Gradually, the other marks became clearer, letters that spelled out simple words when I held up a hand mirror to reverse them: help, remember, lonely. I began talking to the mirror during these sessions, telling Catherine about my day, about the changes that had been made to the apartment since her time, about the world outside that she could no longer see. Sometimes the condensation would form patterns that seemed like responses, a heart shape, or what might have been a smiley face, or simply the repeated handprint that I came to interpret as acknowledgement. The building's superintendent, Mr. Kowalski, had worked there since the early 1970s. When I casually mentioned Catherine Mills during a conversation about the apartment's history, his expression grew thoughtful. "Oh yes, poor Catherine," he said. "Terrible thing, that accident. She was such a quiet tenant, very neat, very polite. Always said hello when we passed in the hallway." He paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. "You know, after she passed, we had trouble renting that unit for a while. Tenants would complain about cold spots in the bathroom, or say they felt like they were being watched. But that was decades ago. These old buildings, they have their quirks. Did anyone ever mention problems with the mirror?" I asked. Mr. Kowalski's eyes sharpened slightly. "Funny you should ask. There was one tenant, this was maybe 15 years ago, who insisted the mirror was defective. Said it fogged up in patterns that didn't make sense. Claimed she could see handprints that weren't hers. We had the mirror professionally cleaned, checked the ventilation, even had a plumber look at the shower fixtures. Everything was normal." "What happened to that tenant?" "She broke her lease early, said the bathroom made her uncomfortable. After that, we've been more careful about who we rent to. People who appreciate vintage charm, who understand that old buildings have character." That night, armed with this new information, I approached my evening routine with Catherine differently. Instead of just observing the handprints and attempting to decipher messages, I tried to communicate more directly. "Catherine, I know about the accident," I said to the fogging mirror. "I know what happened to you here. I'm not afraid, and I'm not going to leave like the other tenant did. But I want to understand what you need." The handprint appeared, but this time it was accompanied by something I hadn't seen before, the clear outline of a full hand. Fingers spread wide, pressed against the glass. Around it, letters began to form in the condensation, more clearly than ever before. Not accident. I stared at the words until the fog shifted and obscured them, my heart racing. When the mirror cleared, I immediately ran more hot water, waiting for the condensation to form again. "What do you mean, not an accident?" I asked the fog. This time, the letters came slowly, appearing one at a time, as if being written by an invisible finger, pushed. The word hung in the fog for nearly a minute before the natural circulation of air in the bathroom began to disperse. I stood there staring at my own pale reflection in the clearing mirror, trying to process what Catherine was telling me. The next day, I returned to the library with new purpose. Instead of looking for information about Catherine's death, I researched who else had lived in the building during 1967. The tenant records were incomplete, but I found enough to piece together a picture of the Belmont's residence during that period. In apartment 3B, directly next to Catherine's, lived Harold Brennan, a man in his 40s who worked as a traveling salesman. He had moved out abruptly just 2 weeks after Catherine's death, leaving no forwarding address. His lease had another 6 months to run, but he'd forfeited his security deposit and disappeared without explanation. I dug deeper into Harold Brennan's background and found a troubling pattern. In 3 different cities where he'd lived previously, young women living alone had died in what were ruled accidental deaths: falls downstairs, slips in bathtubs, carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heaters. Each death had occurred within months of Brennan moving into the same building as the victim. That evening, I shared my discoveries with Catherine's presence in the mirror. As the fog formed and her handprint appeared. I told her what I'd learned about Harold Brennan, about the pattern of deaths that followed his movements from city to city. The mirror's response was immediate and dramatic. Instead of the usual single handprint, multiple handprints appeared in the condensation, different sizes, different positions, as if several people were pressing their hands against the glass from the other side. Around them, words formed quickly. "We know. He killed us. Remember us." I realized that Catherine wasn't alone in whatever space existed behind the mirror. The other women who had died in Harold Brennan's wake were there with her, trapped perhaps by the violent nature of their deaths, united in their need to be remembered and believed. Over the following weeks, they shared their stories with me through the fogged mirror. Sarah from Phoenix, who had fallen down her apartment building's stairs. Michelle from Denver, found dead in her bath with a head injury. Lisa from St. Louis, who had succumbed to carbon monoxide in her sleep. Each death had been carefully orchestrated to look accidental, and in each case, Harold Brennan had vanished shortly afterward, leaving no trace of his true identity or destination. The women told me that Brennan had been a master manipulator, charming and helpful to his female neighbors, gaining their trust before finding opportunities to strike. He would study their routines, learn their vulnerabilities, then create situations that appeared to be tragic accidents, but were actually cold-blooded murder. Catherine's story was typical of his method. He had befriended her, offering to help with heavy groceries or small repairs in her apartment. On the night she died, he had knocked on her door claiming to smell gas from her unit, suggesting there might be a leak that required immediate attention. When she opened the door in her bathrobe, having just finished her shower, he forced his way inside and struck her down in the bathroom, arranging her body to suggest a slip and fall. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked the mirror one evening. "What do you want me to do?" The answer came slowly, letter by letter. "Find him. Stop him. Justice." I spent the next month becoming an amateur detective, using the names and dates the women had given me to trace Harold Brennan's path through the decades since Catherine's death. It was painstaking work, complicated by the fact that he almost certainly used different identities in different cities. But gradually, a pattern emerged. Harold Brennan was still alive, still killing. I found records of suspicious accidental deaths that matched his pattern in 6 different cities. Since 1967, always involving young women living alone. Always followed by the sudden departure of a male neighbor whose background couldn't be verified. The most recent death had occurred just 8 months earlier in Portland, Oregon. A woman named Jennifer Walsh had been found at the bottom of her apartment building's stairwell, apparently having fallen while carrying laundry. A neighbor who had tried to help her with her groceries several times had moved out of the building the following week. With the information the women had given me, I was able to piece together enough details to contact the Portland Police Department. I spoke with Detective Maria Santos, who had investigated Jennifer's death and filed it as accidental, but had noted several inconsistencies that troubled her. The thing that bothered me, Detective Santos told me over the phone, was the neighbor who disappeared. Robert Brennan called himself. Always seemed helpful, always around when women in the building needed assistance. But when we tried to follow up with him after Jennifer's death, we discovered his rental application was full of false information. No such person had ever worked for the company he listed as his employer. I shared what I'd learned about the pattern of deaths, the false identities, the consistent method of operation. Detective Santos was skeptical at first, understandably so, given that my information came from conversations with mirrors. But when she began checking the details I provided against her own investigation, she found too many correlations to dismiss. "How did you come by this information?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "I live in the apartment where Catherine Mills died in 1967. I believe she's been trying to communicate what really happened to her, and she's not alone. There are other victims who want their deaths to be properly investigated. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Detective Santos said, "I've been a cop for 20 years. I've learned not to dismiss information just because the source seems unusual. If you're right about this pattern, we're dealing with a serial killer who's been operating for over 50 years, working with Detective Santos and investigators in several other cities. We were able to build a case against the man who had called himself Harold Brennan, Robert Brennan, Harry Brennan, and at least a dozen other variations on the same identity. DNA evidence from several crime scenes. Financial records that showed the same pattern of behavior across decades. And witness statements that matched his appearance and methods all pointed to the same conclusion. The man we were hunting was years old now, but still active. We traced him to a senior living community in Sacramento, where he was living under the name Henry Brennan and had already begun cultivating relationships with several elderly women who lived alone. His arrest made national news. A serial killer who had operated undetected for over half a century, whose victims had been dismissed as accidents or natural deaths. The case prompted reviews of hundreds of similar deaths across the country, and several more victims were identified. During his interrogation, Harold Brennan confessed to 14 murders, including Catherine Mills. He showed no remorse, describing his victims as practice runs and expressing pride in his ability to avoid detection for so long. He was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The night after his sentencing, I ran my usual hot shower and waited for the mirror to fog. Catherine's handprint appeared one final time, but it was different, lighter somehow, less desperate. Around it, words formed in the condensation. "Thank you. We can rest now." As I watched, other handprints appeared briefly in the fog. Sarah, Michelle, Lisa, Jennifer, and others whose names I'd learned during the investigation. One by one, they pressed their hands against the glass in what felt like a gesture of goodbye, then faded away. The mirror cleared, and I saw only my own reflection looking back at me. I waited for more fog to form, but the glass remained clear, even as steam continued to rise from the hot shower. The temperature in the bathroom felt normal for the first time since I'd moved in, and the mirror reflected only what was actually in front of it. Catherine and the others were at peace now, their deaths acknowledged, their killer brought to justice. They no longer needed to press their hands against the barrier between worlds, trying to make the living understand what had really happened to them. I still live in apartment 3A, still take long showers in that beautiful vintage bathroom, but the mirror never fogs in patterns anymore, never shows handprints that don't belong to me. Sometimes I miss the strange conversations I had with Catherine, the sense of connection to someone whose life had been cut tragically short. But I know she's no longer trapped in that liminal space behind the glass, no longer desperate to be heard and believed. She and the others have moved on to whatever comes after. Their stories finally told, their truth finally acknowledged. The rain is gentle against my windows tonight, a soft percussion that reminds me how thin the boundaries can be between the living and the dead, between justice and injustice, between being forgotten and being remembered. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen, to believe, to act on behalf of those who can no longer speak for themselves. The mirror reflects only truth now. My face, tired but peaceful. In a bathroom where terrible things once happened, but where peace has finally been restored. And perhaps that's the most important reflection of all. Not the ghostly handprints of the past, but the clear image of someone who chose to bear witness, to remember, and to ensure that forgotten voices were finally heard. Sleep well tonight, knowing that some stories, no matter how long buried, will always find a way to surface when the time is right. Like handprints appearing in fog on an old mirror that remembers everything. My chair was rocking. Itself let the rain carry you back, with me tonight, to a place where silence holds weight and shadows remember what they've seen. Pull your blankets closer, settle into the rhythm of water against glass, and let me tell you about the chair that taught me that some furniture holds more than just the impression of bodies that have sat in it. Some pieces hold entire lives, entire deaths, and sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, they hold the spaces in between. This happened 3 months ago, though it feels like years. Time moves differently when you're afraid to sit down in your own home. I want you to understand that I'm not someone who believes in ghosts, or at least I wasn't. I'm a practical person, a software engineer who deals in logic and code and problems that have solutions. But some problems, I learned, don't want to be solved. They want to be witnessed, I inherited the chair from my grandmother Rose after she passed last spring. She was 92 and had lived in the same house for 70 years. The kind of woman who kept everything and wasted nothing. When my family went through her belongings, most of the furniture was claimed by cousins and aunts, but no one wanted the rocking chair. It wasn't particularly beautiful, oak with a faded floral cushion that had seen better decades. The wood was dark with age and wear, smooth from countless hands that had gripped its arms. My grandmother had told me once that it was her mother's chair and her grandmother's before that. 4 generations of women had rocked babies to sleep in it, had sat knitting while husbands read newspapers, had kept vigil through long nights when children ran fevers. It's too old, my cousin Sarah said when we were dividing up the estate. Too big for modern houses. You can probably donate it somewhere. But something about that chair called to me. Maybe it was the memory of my grandmother sitting in it during my childhood visits. Her weathered hands moving knitting needles in steady rhythm while she told me stories about her own grandmother. Or maybe it was the way the afternoon light fell across its curved back, making the wood grain look like flowing water. Whatever the reason, I arranged to have it shipped to my apartment in Portland. The movers delivered it on a Tuesday in late September. My apartment was small, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian, but I found space for it by the living room window that faced the street. It fit perfectly in the corner, as if the room had been waiting for it. That first evening, I sat in it while working on my laptop. The chair was surprisingly comfortable, the seat worn to just the right angle, the arms at the perfect height for resting my elbows. It creaked gently when I rocked, a sound like old ships settling into harbor. I worked until nearly midnight, the gentle motion helping me think through a particularly stubborn coding problem. When I finally got up to go to bed, I gave the chair one last look. It sat perfectly still in the dim light from the street lamp outside, looking dignified and peaceful, just a piece of furniture in its proper place. I woke that night to the sound of creaking. At first, I thought it was the building settling. Old houses make noises, especially when the temperature drops. But as I lay there listening, I realized the sound had a rhythm to it. Back and forth, the measured tempo of someone rocking slowly in a chair. My bedroom was directly above the living room, and the sound was coming from below. I checked my phone. 3:17 in the morning. The creaking continued, soft but persistent, like a grandmother soothing a crying baby in the dark hours before dawn. I got up and crept to the top of the stairs, listening. The sound was definitely coming from the living room. Step by step, I made my way down, the old wooden stairs protesting under my feet despite my attempts at stealth. The living room was dark, except for the pale light filtering through the window. But I could see the chair clearly. It was moving, back and forth, in a steady rhythm that made no sense. There was no wind, no vibration from passing traffic, nothing that could explain why a heavy wooden chair would be rocking on its own. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, watching this impossible thing happen in my living room. The movement wasn't violent or dramatic. It was gentle, purposeful, the kind of rocking you'd use to calm a fussy child or ease the pain of arthritis. It continued for perhaps another minute while I watched, then gradually slowed and stopped. as if whoever had been sitting in it had finally fallen asleep. I approached the chair carefully, running my hands over the cushion, checking for some rational explanation. The fabric was cool to the touch, undisturbed. There were no strings attached, no hidden mechanisms, nothing that would cause it to move. I sat down in it myself, testing whether there was some kind of balance issue that might cause spontaneous motion, but it remained perfectly still under my weight. Eventually, I convinced myself that I'd been dreaming, or that the sound had come from somewhere else. Sand upstairs neighbor, perhaps, or pipes settling in the walls. I went back to bed and managed to fall asleep, though it took much longer than usual. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was ready for it. I'd left my bedroom door open and had positioned my phone on the nightstand with the recording app ready. At exactly 3:17, the creaking began. I started the recording and crept downstairs, documenting everything. The chair was rocking just as it had the night before, moving with that same gentle, purposeful rhythm. In the recording, you can hear my breathing, my footsteps on the stairs, and underneath it all, the steady creak-pause creak of wood flexing under weight that wasn't there. I watched for 10 minutes this time, trying to detect any pattern or variation in the movement. It was remarkably consistent, never speeding up or slowing down, never changing the arc of its motion, just the patient back and forth of someone who had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. When it stopped, it did so gradually, like a music box winding down. I approached and sat in it again, but whatever presence had been there was gone. The chair was just a chair, silent and still. I spent the next day researching the history of the house where my grandmother had lived, looking for some explanation for what I was experiencing. What I found made me wish I'd never brought the chair home. The house had been built in 1898 by a doctor named Samuel Hartwell and his wife, Margaret. They'd had 3 children, but only one, a daughter named Eleanor, had survived to adulthood. The other 2, twin boys named Thomas and William, had died in infancy from scarlet fever. Margaret Hartwell had reportedly never recovered from the loss. Neighbors' accounts from the time described her sitting for hours in a rocking chair by the nursery window, staring out at the garden where the boys were buried. She would rock and hum lullabies to empty air, talking to children who were no longer there. The chair was described in an estate sale catalog from 1924, when the Hartwells' daughter sold the house after her parents' deaths. Oak rocking chair with floral cushion, much beloved by the late Mrs. Hartwell. It had been purchased by a young woman named Rose Murphy, my great-great-grandmother. That night, I decided to stay awake and confront whatever was happening. I set up my laptop on the coffee table facing the chair, with the camera recording. I made coffee, turned on all the lights, and settled in to wait. 3:17 came and went with nothing happening. The chair sat motionless in its corner, looking perfectly ordinary under the bright living room lights. I began to feel foolish, wondering if the darkness had been playing tricks on my eyes. If the creaking had some mundane explanation I'd overlooked. At 3:37, the lights went out. Not just my lights, the entire building went dark, along with the street lamps outside. Through my windows, I could see that the blackout extended 4 blocks in every direction. My laptop, running on battery power, provided the only illumination in the room, and in that pale blue glow from the screen, I saw her. She was sitting in the chair, though sitting wasn't quite the right word. She was there, the way heat shimmer is there on hot asphalt, visible but not solid, present but not entirely real. An elderly woman in a long white nightgown, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. Her hands rested on the arms of the chair, and she was rocking slowly, just as the chair had been rocking on its own. But she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on something to her left, in the empty corner where my bookshelf stood. She was smiling, the kind of soft, adoring smile you give to sleeping children. Her lips were moving, though I couldn't hear what she was saying. I tried to speak, to ask who she was, but no sound came out. The air in the room had grown thick and heavy, charged with the kind of electricity that comes before thunderstorms. My laptop screen flickered, and for a moment I was afraid the battery would die and leave me in complete darkness with whatever this was. The woman continued rocking, continued speaking to her invisible companions. Sometimes she would lean forward slightly, as if adjusting a blanket or stroking a small head. Once, she held out her arms as if picking up a baby, cradling the empty air against her chest and swaying gently. I understood then. Margaret Hartwell had never stopped rocking her dead children to sleep. Even death hadn't broken that habit, that need to comfort and soothe. She was still there, still mourning, still trying to give her babies the peace they'd never found in life. The power came back on as suddenly as it had gone out, flooding the room with harsh electric light. The chair was empty, rocking slowly, to a stop as if someone had just stood up from it. My laptop had captured everything, the darkness, the power failure, and what looked like empty air rocking back and forth. But I knew what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch, watching the chair, waiting for 317 to come around again, but it remained still. Whatever had needed to show itself to me was satisfied, at least for now. The next few days passed quietly. The chair didn't rock, and I began to hope that the experience had been some kind of one-time event, a message delivered and completed. I even started sitting in it again while I worked, though I always felt like I was intruding on someone else's space. But Margaret Hartwell wasn't finished with me yet. It started with cold spots. I'd be sitting at my kitchen table or working at my desk, and suddenly the temperature would drop 20 degrees in a small area around me. Not the whole room, just a bubble of cold air, as if someone were standing very close. The cold would last for a few minutes, then fade as gradually as it had come. Then came the sounds during the day. Not the rhythmic rocking, but other noises that belonged to a house with children. The patter of small feet running across hardwood floors. Giggles from empty rooms. The soft thud of toys being dropped. Once, I heard what sounded like a music box playing a lullaby. Though I owned no music boxes, I began to understand that Margaret wasn't the only presence in my apartment. She'd brought her children with her, or perhaps they'd never left the chair that had been their haven in life. They were all there together, a family reunited in death, playing out the scenes of love and care that had been cut short by disease. The manifestations grew stronger. I'd come home from work to find books pulled from shelves, not scattered, but carefully stacked in small piles on the floor, as if children had been building with them. Kitchen chairs would be moved away from the table, positioned as if for an invisible tea party. Once I found all the throw pillows from my couch arranged in a circle on the living room floor, like a nest where small bodies might curl up for afternoon naps. I should have been terrified. Any rational person would have gotten rid of the chair, maybe moved apartments entirely. But instead, I found myself oddly comforted by these signs of presence. My apartment, which had always felt too quiet, too empty, now hummed with invisible life. I was sharing my space with a family, even if that family had been dead for over a century. I started leaving small offerings. Cookies on the kitchen counter that would be found the next morning with tiny bite marks that could have been from mice, but weren't. Children's books borrowed from the library, left open on the coffee table, 2 pages with pictures of families, and gardens, and rocking horses. A music box I bought at an antique store, wound and left to play its tinkling melody into the empty air. The rocking continued every night, at 3:17, but now I understood it differently. It wasn't haunting in the traditional sense, it was devotion. Margaret was still doing what mothers do, providing comfort and security to her children. The chair had become her eternal nursery, and I was simply the current caretaker of that sacred space. One night, in early November, I woke not to the sound of rocking, but to the sound of crying. It was coming from the living room, the heartbroken sobs of a woman who had lost everything. I found Margaret in the chair, no longer translucent, but solid-looking, real as life. She was bent forward, her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with grief. This time, I could speak. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. "What can I do?" She looked up at me with eyes that held a century of sorrow. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through autumn leaves, barely audible but perfectly clear. "They're growing up," she said. "Even here, even now, they're growing up and growing away from me. Thomas wants to play outside where I can't follow. William asks questions I can't answer. They're becoming themselves instead of just my babies." I understood. Even in death, even in this space between worlds, children grow and change. Margaret had been holding on to them through sheer force of will and love, but love sometimes means letting go. "Maybe that's okay," I said carefully. "Maybe it's time." She looked back at the corner where her invisible children played. "But what will I do without them? What am I without being their mother?" "You'll always be their mother," I told her. "That doesn't change. But maybe they need to move on, and maybe you do too." Margaret was quiet for a long time, rocking slowly in the chair that had been her anchor for so many decades. Finally, she nodded. "Double quotes, will you sit with me tonight?" she asked. While I say goodbye, I pulled a kitchen chair over to sit beside the rocking chair. Margaret began to speak, but not to me, to Thomas and William, wherever they were in the room. She told them stories about their father, about the house they'd lived in, about the dreams she'd had for their futures. She sang lullabies in a voice that grew stronger and clearer as the night went on. As dawn approached, the air in the room began to change. It grew warmer, lighter somehow, as if windows were being opened to let in fresh spring air. Margaret's form became less solid, more like morning mist touched by sunlight. "Thank you," she said to me, "for letting us stay, for understanding." "Thank you," I replied, "for letting me be part of your family." She smiled then, the first truly peaceful expression I'd seen on her face. "Take care of the chair. Someone else will need it someday." The room filled with golden light, and for just a moment, I saw them, two small boys with dark hair and their mother's gentle eyes, taking her hands and leading her toward something I couldn't see. Then they were gone, and the chair sat empty, in the morning sunlight streaming through my window. The apartment felt different after that. Not empty, but quiet in a natural way. The chair still rocked sometimes, but now it was just the wind from the heating vents or the vibration from heavy trucks passing on the street. The cold spots disappeared, along with the phantom sounds of children at play. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the rain falls steadily against my windows, I sit in Margaret's chair and feel the accumulated love of all the women who rocked their children here. It's not haunted anymore, it's blessed. A piece of furniture that has absorbed so much care and devotion that it radiates comfort like heat from a banked fire. I understand now why none of my relatives wanted the chair, why it was left for me to claim. They sensed what it carried, the weight of love and loss that made it too heavy for their hearts to bear. But I needed that weight. I needed to learn that some ghosts aren't trying to frighten us, they're trying to show us what it means to love so completely that not even death can break the bonds we forge. The chair rocks gently now, as the rain continues to fall, moved only by my own motion, holding only my own weight. But in its creaking rhythm, I hear the echo of all the lullabies it has witnessed, all the prayers whispered into its worn wooden arms. It reminds me that we are all connected across time and space by the simple acts of care we perform for each other, the small comforts we offer, the love we refuse to let die. Sleep now, and let the rain sing you the same songs Margaret sang to her children, the same songs that mothers have hummed since the beginning of time. Remember that love is the only ghost worth believing in. the only presence that truly haunts us, following us through life and death, and into whatever gentle darkness waits beyond. Close your eyes and rock slowly with the rhythm of your own breathing, and know that somewhere, in chairs like mine around the world, love keeps its vigil, patient and eternal, waiting for the next soul who needs to be held.